Who fixed my Harley? Silas Maddox's voice cut through the garage like a blade. Every wrench stopped moving. Every man froze. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before 13 mechanics grown men who spent their careers handling iron and fire slowly turned their heads toward the woman standing by the mop sink with grease beneath her fingernails. Nobody said her name. They just pointed. If you've ever been the person in the room that everyone looks through instead of at, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and follow Mara's story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Silas Maddox rolled his Harley into Iron Creek Motor Works. The sky above Marlow, Tennessee was the color of old iron gray and heavy and carrying the promise of something difficult. He didn't call ahead. Men like Silas never called ahead. He simply appeared at the service bay entrance at 7:43 in the morning, pushing his motorcycle by the handlebars, while the engine ticked and popped behind him like something wounded. Nolan Voss saw him first. Nolan always saw the important clients. First, it was a talent he'd cultivated over 15 years of running the most prominent motorcycle shop between Knoxville and Asheville. He came out from behind the service counter with his hands already extended, already smiling, already calculating. Silas, hell of a morning to bring her in. Let's see what we're working with. Silas didn't shake the hand. He looked at it for a moment, then looked back at his Harley. And Nolan lowered his arm without making a scene, because that was also a talent he'd cultivated, knowing when to retreat gracefully. The motorcycle was a 1998 Harley-Davidson Electra Glide, painted black so deep it absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Most bikes that age showed their years in chrome, pitting, and seat creases and the 1,000 small surrenders that machines make when they're not properly loved. This one didn't. Every scratch on the tank was deliberate, preserved, almost protected. The mirrors were original, the pipes were original. The seat was cracked in one specific place near the right seam, and that crack had been filled with leather conditioner so carefully that it looked more like a signature than a flaw. Travis Boone walked over, wiping his hands on a shop rag, and circled the Harley once without touching it. Travis was 34 years old and built like someone who'd never lost an argument with a piece of machinery. He had the kind of confidence that filled a room before he spoke, and he spoke before thinking often enough that the other mechanics had stopped correcting him. "She's a beauty," Travis said. "What's the issue?" "Engine drops power," Silas said. "Starts fine. Idles fine. But under load, halfway through a climb, she loses pressure. Oil light flickers. Then the power goes." He paused. "And there's a vibration. High in the chest. Comes on when she heats up." Travis nodded like a man confirming what he already knew. "Probably the fuel delivery. Maybe a sensor. We'll pull the codes and go from there." "You'll find more than codes," Silas said quietly. Travis smiled, the kind of smile that meant he'd stop listening. "We always do." What neither man noticed was the woman in the gray work shirt who was sweeping the far corner of the bay. She had stopped sweeping the moment Silas pushed the Harley through the door. She stood with the broom handle resting in both hands, watching the motorcycle the way a doctor watches a patient walk into the room, cataloging everything before anyone asked a question. Her name was Mara Ellison. She was 38 years old, with honeybee blonde hair pulled back in a practical knot and blue-gray eyes that had learned, over several hard years, to observe without appearing to. She wore a gray shop shirt with Iron Creek stitched above the left pocket and her first name written in ballpoint pen on a piece of masking tape below it because no one had bothered to order her a proper name tag in the 4 months she'd worked there. Her official title was Facility Maintenance and Inventory Assistant. Practice, this meant she swept, she restocked, she checked deliveries against manifests, and she carried coffee to men who called her Blondie without looking up from their work. 2 of the mechanics didn't know her name at all. One of them, a senior tech named Garrett, had started a running joke about the cleaning lady solving mysteries, which the other men found funnier than they should have. Mara had laughed along the first few times because she needed the job. The laughter had stopped being automatic around week 3. By week 7, she'd simply stopped reacting entirely, and the men had decided this meant she didn't understand the jokes. She understood everything. She watched Travis connect the diagnostic scanner to Silas's Harley and saw, from 20 feet away, that he plugged it into the wrong data port. She watched him pull a fault code, P0521, oil pressure sensor, and watched him decide immediately that the sensor was the problem, which was the kind of confident, incomplete reasoning that turned a 2-hour repair into a 2-week disaster. She went back to sweeping because this was not the first time she had watched Travis make that mistake. And the first 3 times she'd tried to say something, he'd talked over her before she finished the sentence. That had been on other people's motorcycles. This was Silas Maddox's Harley. And even Mara knew enough about Silas Maddox to understand that different rules might eventually apply. The Hells Angels chapter that operated out of Marlow was not large, maybe 30 full members, but it carried a weight in the region that had nothing to do with size. Silas had run the chapter for 11 years. He was not a violent man by preference, but he was an absolutely certain man, which was sometimes more intimidating than violence. People in Marlow knew his face, the way they knew the face of the county courthouse, something permanent and weather-worn and not to be tested carelessly. His full name was Silas Grave Maddox, and the road name had not come from any act of cruelty. It had come from the story of a night 18 years ago when Silas had sat by a fresh grave in a cemetery outside Nashville for 6 straight hours after burying his closest friend, a man named Jonah Reyes, who had died at 41 from a heart attack that nobody had seen coming. The man who gave Silas the name said it was because he'd looked like a part of the earth that day, something fixed and permanent and unreachable. The Harley was Jonah's motorcycle, originally. They had rebuilt it together in Jonah's garage over a winter that Silas still thought about when he needed to feel young again. Silas had bought it from Jonah's widow for $1, with her blessing, the week after the funeral. In 18 years, he had put over 60,000 miles on it, and he had never changed a single non-mechanical element of its appearance. Every scratch was Jonah's scratch. Every dent told a story that belonged to both of them. Losing that engine would be like losing the last recording of a voice he couldn't get back. Travis replaced the oil pressure sensor on day 1. The problem reappeared on day 2. He replaced the fuel injectors on day 3. The power drop worsened on day 4. He checked the plugs, the fuel lines, the throttle position sensor, the intake manifold gaskets. He brought in a second mechanic named Curry, who agreed with every diagnosis Travis had already made. They replaced parts that didn't need replacing and left the parts that did need replacing exactly where they were. By the end of the first week, they had spent over $3,000 of Silas's money, and the Harley ran worse than the day it arrived. Mara watched all of it. She wasn't watching to feel superior. She was watching because she couldn't stop herself. The same way a person who speaks another language cannot stop translating in their head when they hear it spoken badly. The motorcycle was talking in a language she knew fluently, and everything the mechanics were doing was a response to a translation they had gotten wrong at the start and refused to revisit. The oil pressure drop, the power loss under load, the metallic vibration that appeared in the cam chest precisely when the engine reached operating temperature. These were not independent symptoms. They were a single story told from 3 different directions, and every story has one true beginning. On the 8th day, during a test run in the parking lot, Mara counted the seconds. She had been doing this mentally for days, but now she had a small notepad, the kind she used for inventory counts, and she wrote it down. Vibration onset, engine temperature 195 degrees. Oil pressure fluctuation, 7 seconds after vibration. Power drop, 4 seconds after pressure fluctuation. 7 seconds every time. Exactly 7 seconds between the vibration and the pressure loss. That kind of precision was not a coincidence. That was a mechanical sequence, a chain of events with a single trigger. The vibration came first, which meant something in the area of the cam chest was generating it. The pressure dropped second, which meant the vibration was physically affecting the oil circuit. 7 seconds of vibration before the oil starved. She knew what it was. She had seen it once before, years ago in Milwaukee, on a performance build that a customer had brought in with the exact same complaint. A counterfeit cam chain tensioner with a composite shoe that disintegrated under sustained heat, sending fragments into the oil passage and blocking delivery. The fix had taken her 40 minutes that first time, including cleanup. She almost didn't say anything. She had learned through a sequence of experiences that had cost her more than most people would understand, that saying the right thing in the wrong room could destroy you more completely than saying nothing at all. But on the 8th day, Travis was in the bay alone, preparing to run another diagnostic sequence, and Mara was restocking coolant on the nearby shelf, and she made a decision that she would not fully understand until later. "The vibration starts in the cam chest," she said. She didn't look at him when she said it. She kept restocking coolant. 7 seconds before the pressure drops. Every time. "That's not a sensor problem." Travis looked up. His expression was the specific variety of skeptical that men deployed when they were caught off guard and didn't want to show it. "What?" "I've been timing it. The sequence is consistent. If it were the sensor, the failure pattern would be random. This pattern isn't random." She finally turned and looked at him. "I think the tensioner shoe is fragmenting. You'd need to check the oil return for debris." Travis stared at her for a long moment. Then his expression settled into something easier, a kind of amused tolerance, which was almost worse than outright dismissal because it came wrapped in a thin layer of politeness that made it impossible to argue against directly. "Mara," he said, and the way he said her name carried a weight that had nothing to do with her name. "I appreciate that. I really do. But we've run 4 full diagnostic sequences. The tensioner's a long-shot theory on a bike this age." "I know the bike's age," she said. "The original tensioner would have worn differently. If it was replaced with an aftermarket part, we'd have documentation, would you?" The pause that followed was brief, but something moved through it, a flicker of uncertainty that Travis covered quickly by reaching for his scanner. "I'll keep it in mind," he said, which meant he wouldn't, and they both knew it. She went back to the coolant shelf. Her hands were steady. She had to keep her hands steady. Nolan came by 30 minutes later, and she heard Travis say something to him in a low voice. She couldn't make out the words from where she stood, but she heard Nolan laugh a short, deliberate sound, and then his footsteps crossed the bay toward her. "Mara." Nolan's voice was the voice he used with customers who were confused about their invoices, patient, explaining, slightly condescending. "I know you're observant. That's a good quality. But when the boys are working on a client bike, especially a client like Silas Maddox, I need you focused on your station." "Yeah?" She looked at him. "I gave Travis a diagnostic observation. It took 15 seconds. I understand. But there's a chain of expertise in this shop, and it exists for a reason. Our mechanics have certifications. They have experience. They have training. You have a good eye for inventory discrepancies, and I value that." He smiled. "Stay in your lane, and everyone's happy." She held his gaze for 2 more seconds, long enough to be clear, short enough to be professional, and then she nodded and walked back to the supply room. Her lane. She thought about that for a while. By the end of the second week, 6 more mechanics had inspected the Harley. Nolan had brought in 2 of them from a shop in Knoxville as consultants. The consultants recommended a complete engine replacement. Nolan presented the estimate to Silas on a Tuesday afternoon, $17,800, with the practiced sympathy of a doctor delivering difficult news. Silas stood at the service counter for a long time without speaking. Mara was logging a parts delivery nearby, working through a manifest, and she watched him from the corner of her eye. She had seen people receive bad news before. She knew the difference between a man processing grief and a man processing frustration. What moved across Silas Maddox's face was grief. "The engine goes, the bike's not the same bike," he said finally. His voice was level. Everything about him was level. In the way that deep water is level, not calm exactly, but contained. "I understand that," Nolan said, "but we've exhausted the—" "You haven't exhausted anything," Silas said. You've replaced parts that weren't broken and charged me for the privilege. He put both hands flat on the counter. Find me the actual problem. Don't tell me it can't be done. Nolan said the things that managers say when they are caught between a client's money and the limits of their team's competence. He said words like comprehensive and thorough and established protocol. Silas listened to all of them with the patience of a man who had heard excuses for a long time and had learned to measure them by weight rather than content. When Nolan finished, Silas said, "I'll be back Thursday. If you can't give me answers by Thursday, I'm taking the bike to someone who can." He left without touching the coffee Nolan's assistant had put beside him. That evening, the shop closed at 6. The mechanics cleared out in stages, Travis first, then Curry, then the others, each of them shedding the day's frustrations in the parking lot with the particular energy of men who have not succeeded but are satisfied that they have tried. Nolan locked the office and left at 6:40. Mara was still there. She was usually still there. Her shift officially ended at 6. But she had developed a habit of staying an extra half hour to complete paperwork at a pace that no one rushed, in a space that no one crowded her out of. It was the quietest 30 minutes of her day. She was at the supply room counter when she heard the side door open. Silas Maddox walked back into the garage. He didn't see her at first. The supply room had a half-wall partition, and she was behind it, and he wasn't looking for anyone. He walked directly to his Harley, which was parked in Bay 3 with a diagnostic tag hanging from the mirror. He stood beside it for a long moment, not touching it. Then he spoke. "I'm sorry, Jonah." His voice was barely above a murmur, but the garage had the acoustic quality of a cathedral, every sound carried. "I've had 13 men look at you, and none of them know what they're looking at. I should have taken better care of her." He was quiet for a moment. "The ride's in 4 days. I can't take her up the mountain if she's going to die on me up there. But I can't leave her either. You know that. You'd understand that." He put one hand on the tank. Not the grip of a mechanic preparing to work, the touch of someone saying goodbye to something they can't fix. He stood there for another minute, and then he turned and walked back to the side door, and the door closed behind him, and the garage was completely silent. Mara didn't move for almost a full minute. She had not meant to hear that. She was not the kind of person who cataloged other people's private moments for later use, and what she had just witnessed was something she understood: the specific grief of a person who carries someone they've lost inside an object and feels that person slipping away every time the object deteriorates. She knew that grief. She'd felt it herself over different objects, different losses. She looked at the Harley. She looked at the time. 6:55. She thought about her job, about Nolan's face, about Travis's easy condescension, about the 9 other people who were going to be on that mountain in 4 days on motorcycles, that she now had a separate, specific concern about, a concern that she hadn't fully articulated yet, but that was forming in the back of her mind like weather. She thought about 14 years of knowing exactly what to do with a machine like the one in Bay 3, and the way that knowledge had been taken from her, and the way she had spent 2 years learning to exist as if she'd never had it. Then she walked out from behind the partition, crossed the garage floor, and pulled on a pair of shop gloves from the workbench. She knelt beside the Harley. She placed her stethoscope, a mechanic's stethoscope, that she kept in the bottom of her bag, that she had carried for 11 years out of habit, against the cam chest cover, and tapped the throttle linkage by hand to create mechanical motion. The sound that came back was specific and recognizable. The faint, arrhythmic scraping of something that had broken into pieces and was moving freely inside an oil passage. She was not guessing anymore. She reached for the primary cover bolts with the steady, unhurried focus of someone returning to a language they had never stopped knowing. The cam chain tensioner came off in her hands 6 minutes later, and when she looked at the composite shoe, the small, curved piece of polymer that rode against the chain and kept it properly tensioned, she found what she'd expected. It was disintegrating. 3 fragments had already broken free. The shoe material was not the dense, heat-resistant composite used in authentic components. It was cheaper, softer, and it had been failing for weeks, shedding debris into the oil return, which was carrying fragments directly into the passage and blocking flow whenever the throttle opened and demand increased. She set the tensioner on a clean rag under the workbench lamp and looked at the label. The label said it was a genuine OEM component. It listed a Harley-Davidson part number. It had what appeared to be an authentic serial mark, but the part number was wrong. Not obviously wrong, in a way that required knowing the correct number, which she did. The casting was slightly underweight. The polymer color was 2 shades too light. It was a counterfeit. A very good counterfeit, but a counterfeit. She sat back on her heels and looked at the invoice hanging from the diagnostic tag. The invoice listed the tensioner replacement performed on day 3 by Travis at the full price of an OEM component. She looked at the part in her hand. She pulled out her inventory notepad and wrote a number, the false serial code on the counterfeit part. Then she stood up and walked to the parts room. She had access to the parts room for inventory purposes. She knew the filing system because she had reorganized it 4 months ago when she started. She pulled 6 recent invoices for other hells. Angel's bikes belonging to members of Silas's chapter that she had seen come and go over the past weeks. She found the same false serial number on parts, installed in 4 of them. She stood in the parts room for a long time, holding those invoices. This was not a mistake. A mistake happened once, maybe twice. 4 occurrences of the same false serial number across 4 different motorcycles on components that would fail under exactly the conditions of a sustained mountain climb was not a mistake. She went back to Bay 3 and finished the repair. She cleaned the oil passage with the methodical precision of someone who had done this specific procedure, enough times that her hands knew the steps before her mind finished forming the instruction. She installed an authentic tensioner from a return shipment. She'd cataloged that morning, a return from a customer who changed their mind about a modification, still in sealed manufacturer packaging, correct weight, correct polymer, correct serial mark. She reset the timing, restored the primary cover, and checked the oil return visually before closing anything up. Then she cleaned the workbench, returned the tools to their places, and stood back. She looked at the invoice for the counterfeit part. She looked at the notepad with the 4 matching serial numbers from other bikes. She looked at her hands. She had come back to this shop because machines were the only thing that had never lied to her. She had accepted invisible work because invisible felt safer than exposed. She had stayed in her lane. God, she had stayed so completely in her lane that she'd nearly watched Silas Maddox ride a disintegrating motorcycle up a mountain rather than risk being dismissed again. She took the counterfeit tensioner, wrapped it in the clean rag, and placed it on the workbench in Bay 3, directly beneath the diagnostic light where it could not be missed. She picked up her bag, collected her stethoscope, and walked to the side door. She stopped. She went back to the workbench and placed her notepad, the one with the 4 serial numbers from the 4 other bikes beside the wrapped tensioner. Then she left. She did not know what the morning would bring. She knew what it would not bring: the sound of Silas Maddox's engine losing pressure on a narrow Appalachian road. That was enough. For tonight, that was exactly enough. The shop opened at 7:30 the next morning. Travis Boone arrived at 7:20, which he did on days when he wanted to be visibly early, and walked through the service bay with a coffee in one hand and the particular energy of a man who had not yet been contradicted. He saw the Harley in Bay 3 and stopped walking. He set his coffee down. He walked to the bike and crouched beside it, looking at the primary cover closed, bolted clean. He stood and looked at the workbench, the rag, the counterfeit tensioner in the center of it, the notepad beside it with 4 lines of handwriting that were not his. He picked up the tensioner and looked at it. He looked at the label. He looked at the part number. He looked at the notepad. He was still holding both when Silas Maddox arrived at 7:45, 2 days ahead of his Thursday deadline, with 3 other Hell's Angels behind him, and walked directly to Bay 3. "I want to see what 13 mechanics couldn't find," Silas said. His eyes moved over the bay, over the Harley, over Travis. over the object in Travis's hand. Start the bike. Travis hesitated for one visible second, the kind that tells a watching person everything. And then he set the tensioner and notepad on the workbench, moved to the Harley, and pressed the start switch. The engine woke without hesitation. It settled into a rhythm that was immediate, even, and deep, the sound of something running as it was designed to run, without interruption, without apology. Under the throttle test, the oil pressure needle moved to its proper position and held there without flutter. Travis ran the bike for 90 seconds. The vibration did not appear. The pressure did not drop. The power delivered exactly as it should have. He released the throttle, and the garage fell into a silence that felt like the moment after a verdict is read. Silas Maddox stood very still. He looked at the bike. He looked at Travis. He looked around the bay slowly, and his gaze moved over every person who had gathered in the entrance of the service area mechanics. The parts assistant, two Hell's Angels who had followed him inside before stopping at the woman, standing beside the mop sink in the gray work shirt with the masking tape name tag, who had arrived at her normal time and was doing her normal work, and who had not looked up since the engine started. Who fixed my Harley? The question was not loud. It didn't need to be. The silence that followed it had weight, the kind of weight that presses down on everyone in the room equally. And nobody wants to be the first person to speak into it. Travis looked at the floor for a fraction of a second. Then every head in that garage turned slowly toward the woman by the mop sink. Mara Ellison looked up. She met Silas Maddox's eyes across the length of Bay 3, and neither of them looked away. Mara didn't move right away. That was the thing. Nobody in that garage expected that she wouldn't flinch, wouldn't shrink, wouldn't do the thing that people who've been invisible for a long time tend to do when suddenly every eye in the room lands on them at once. She just stood there with the mop handle resting in both hands and looked back at Silas Maddox with the steady patience of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment without knowing it. Silas crossed the bay in 12 steps. He didn't rush, but there was nothing leisurely about it either. He stopped 6 feet from her and looked at her the way he'd looked at the Harley, cataloging, measuring, deciding what was real and what was performance. You fixed it, he said. It wasn't a question. I identified the problem, Mara said. And corrected it, yes. When last night, after everyone left, something shifted in the air of the garage. The mechanics who had gathered at the bay entrance were doing the particular kind of stillness that people do when they are simultaneously embarrassed and unwilling to show it. Travis Boone was still standing by the Harley with his arms at his sides and his coffee going cold on the workbench. Silas's eyes moved to the masking tape name tag. Mara, yes. Mara what? Ellison. He held her gaze for another 3 seconds. Who are you, Mara Ellison? And I mean that as a real question, not a polite one. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. That's going to take more than a quick answer. Then give me the longer one. He turned and looked at Travis. Somebody pull up a chair. Nobody pulled up a chair. What they did instead was stop pretending to be doing other things and start paying attention, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Nolan Voss emerged from the office hallway. At that moment he'd arrived during the test run, had seen the engine perform, and had been doing the mental math behind his office door for the past 2 minutes. He came out wearing his public face, the one that suggested he was in control of a situation he was already 3 steps behind. Silas, he said warmly, good news travels fast. I was just reviewing the work order. Looks like we got to the bottom of it, after all. Silas didn't look at him. He was still looking at Mara. After all, he repeated, flat as pavement. These things take time, Nolan said. Complex diagnostic situation. The team put in, Nolan. Silas's voice was level in the specific way that suggested the level was a deliberate choice and not the default. The woman who cleans your floors fixed a problem that your team told me required an $18,000 engine replacement. I'm going to find out how that happened. You can be part of that conversation, or you can go back to your office. But either way, the conversation is happening. Nolan's smile didn't disappear so much as it reorganized itself into something more careful. Of course, he said. Transparency is important. He stepped to the side and stayed there, which was its own answer. about where the power in the room had shifted. Mara had watched this exchange without expression. When Silas turned back to her, she said, "I need to show you something before we get to the longer answer." She walked to the workbench in Bay 3 and picked up the counterfeit tensioner, still wrapped in the rag. She set it down in front of Silas and folded back the cloth. "That came out of your engine last night," she said. "It's listed on your invoice as a genuine OEM cam chain tensioner, part number HD the 331456, installed on day 3 of your repair." She pointed to the part number on the label. "That's not HD 331456. The last 4 digits are transposed. The correct number is HD 331645. The casting weight is off by 6 grams. The composite shoe, the curved piece that was disintegrating, is a lower-grade polymer that begins breaking down at sustained temperatures above 190 degrees. Silas picked up the tensioner. He turned it over in his hands. He was not a man who pretended to expertise he didn't have, so he simply looked at it and listened. "Your engine reaches 195 degrees under load," Mara continued. The shoe was shedding fragments into the oil return passage. "Every time you open the throttle on a climb, the oil flow was partially blocked. That's your pressure drop. That's your power loss. That's the vibration. The chain running without proper tension makes a specific sound, and it propagates into the cam chest." She paused. 7 seconds. From vibration onset to pressure drop. Every single time. 7 seconds. That's how long it took the fragments to travel through the passage and reach the delivery point. Silas set the tensioner down. He looked at it. He looked at the invoice. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you known this?" "I identified the sequence on day 8. I've been timing the test runs." Day 8. His voice was entirely controlled. "We're on day 15. "Yes. You tried to say something." She looked at him directly. "I tried to tell Travis on day 8. He suggested I focus on my job." Travis made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a denial. Something in between. "She did," one of the other mechanics said quietly, from the back of the group. A young guy named Marco, who'd been at the shop 3 months, and who had not, until this moment, said much of anything that wasn't a direct answer to a direct question. She said something about the cam chest. I heard it. The silence that followed that confirmation was different from the earlier silence. This one had edges. Silas turned and looked at Travis fully for the first time since arriving. Travis met it for about 2 seconds before he found something to look at on the floor. "That's a separate conversation," Silas said, in a tone that made clear the conversation would not, in fact, be separate for very long. He turned back to Mara. "What else?" She took a breath. She'd been holding this next part since 11 o'clock the previous night, and she'd rehearsed it enough times that she knew she could say it without her voice shaking. "I looked at the serial number on the counterfeit part and compared it against recent invoices in your file." She placed the notepad on the workbench. 4 other Hell's Angels motorcycles received components with the same false serial code in the past 60 days. 4 of them are scheduled to ride the Blue Ridge route on Thursday. The garage became very quiet. Silas picked up the notepad. He read it. He read it again. Then he set it down carefully, the way a person sets something down when they need their hands free in case they need them for something else. "The Blue Ridge run," he said. "The Appalachian section has extended climbs, sustained high throttle for long stretches. If those engines reach temperature with compromised tensioners, you'll get the same failure pattern you saw in your bike, multiplied by 4. She kept her voice clinical. "On a flat road, losing oil pressure is an emergency. On a narrow mountain road with a sheer drop on one side, it's—" "I know what it is," Silas said. His voice had not risen, but something in the frequency of it had changed. He looked at Nolan. 4 of my people." Nolan was doing a very convincing impression of a man who had just heard all of this for the first time. "Silas, I want to look into this carefully before we—" "You've had 15 days to look into things carefully." Silas turned away from him entirely, a deliberate dismissal that landed harder than a pointed finger. He looked at Mara. "Can you identify the parts in the other bikes?" "Yes." I know the false serial code. I know what to look for in the casting. Then we're going to do that today. He pulled his phone from his pocket. I'm calling the other writers. I'd also suggest, Mara said carefully, that you don't let anyone remove or alter those invoices before you have copies of them. Silas looked at her. A long look, the kind that evaluated not just what was being said, but what the person saying it understood about the full scope of the situation. What he saw in her face was not accusation and not theater. It was the practical calm of someone who had been through a version of this before and knew exactly which threads got pulled first when something like this started unraveling. You've done this before, he said. She held his gaze. I've been on the wrong end of it before, which is a different thing. Something moved across his expression too fast to read precisely, but it was real, and it was not the reaction she'd been bracing herself for. He didn't ask her to explain. Not yet. He made the phone call. Within 40 minutes, the first two Hells Angels riders arrived with their motorcycles. Silas had asked them to come directly to the shop without explanation, and they had come because when Silas asked without explanation, you came and asked questions after. Their names were Rooster and Cal, and they walked into the bay with the particular alertness of men who understood that unscheduled requests meant something had gone wrong. Mara worked in Bay 2 while the mechanics watched. She did not ask for their help, and they did not offer it, which suited everyone for the moment. She was methodical and unhurried, and the contrast between her pace and the tension in the room around her created a strange kind of theater, this still center of deliberate motion surrounded by men who couldn't decide what to do with their hands. The first bike took 20 minutes. She found the counterfeit tensioner in the secondary cam drive position, same false serial code, same lightweight polymer shoe, already beginning to show micro fractures along the contact edge. She set it on the workbench next to Silas's. Nobody spoke. The second bike took 18 minutes. Same finding. The shoe on this one had progressed further, a visible crack along the center line, the kind that was probably 3 or 4 hard rides away from full separation. She set it beside the others. Rooster, who was 51 and had been riding since he was 16 and had never once shown visible distress in the presence of anyone, sat down on a shop stool and looked at the cracked tensioner shoe for a while. That would have gone on the mountain, he said. Not a question. Yes, Mara said. We had 40 riders registered for Thursday. I know. I've been through the recent invoices. The false serial code appears in parts installed on 9 motorcycles in total. 4 confirmed in your chapter. The other 5 need to be checked. Rooster looked at Silas. Silas was looking at the line of counterfeit parts on the workbench, and his expression had the quality of a man calculating something with absolute focus, not rage, which would have been simpler, but the colder, more dangerous state of a person who has identified a threat and is deciding precisely what to do about it. 9, Silas said. At minimum, Mara said. I was only able to check recent records quickly. There may be earlier instances. I'd need more time with the full invoice history. Nolan, who had been standing near the office hallway for the past 40 minutes, performing various versions of calm professionalism, said, I want to be clear that if there was a parts error, it came from our supplier. We relied on. The invoice says OEM, Silas said, without turning. You billed OEM price. What your supplier sent you and what you told me you installed are 2 different things. That's not a supplier problem. There may have been a mislabeling issue on their end that we Nolan, Silas turned now. I've been doing business in this state for 23 years. I know the difference between a mistake and a system. This has a system. Nolan looked at him for a long moment, and something behind his eyes made a small, careful adjustment that Mara had seen before, the recalibration of a person who has just determined that a situation requires a different strategy than the one they've been running. I think we should all take a breath, Nolan said. Let me pull the supplier records, and we can go through this in an organized way. I'd like to go through the inventory room first, Mara said. Everyone looked at her. The invoices reference a supplier batch number. If the batch number appears in the current inventory, There may be additional counterfeit components on the shelf right now, parts that haven't been installed yet, but that would be pulled for future repairs. She kept her voice neutral, factual, the voice she used when she was logging inventory, and didn't want anyone to notice how closely she was paying attention. I can identify them. I know what to look for, Nolan said. The inventory room is a restricted area for liability. She can go, Silas said. Nolan looked at him. She found the problem in your shop that your team missed for 2 weeks, Silas said. She identified counterfeit parts that could have put 9 of my people on the ground on a mountain road. If she wants to look at your inventory room, she looks at your inventory room. He paused. Unless you have a reason she shouldn't. The pause that followed that sentence was exactly 2 seconds long. 2 seconds during which Nolan Voss's face remained composed and his hands remained still, and his eyes made the smallest possible movement not toward the inventory room, but toward the office hallway behind him. The direction of whatever he most needed to reach before anyone else did. Mara had been watching his hands. She'd been watching them for the past 20 minutes. Travis, she said. Travis looked up. Would you come with me? Travis stared at her. The invitation landed strangely on him, she could see it. The unexpected nature of being asked rather than ordered, and by her specifically. He nodded slowly and fell into step beside her. The inventory room was at the back of the shop, past the service bays, through a steel door that required a key code. Mara had the code because she restocked inventory. She'd entered it 600 times. She pushed through without hesitating. The room was organized in the system she had reorganized during her second week on the job, and she moved through it with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything lived. She went directly to the cam drive components section and started checking batch numbers against the code she'd written in her notepad. Travis followed, 3 steps behind her, his arms crossed, his usual confidence replaced by something less certain. He'd been quiet since Marco's confirmation in the bay. Something had shifted in his posture, a slight forward lean, an absence of the usual expansiveness, the body language of a man doing an internal reckoning he hadn't scheduled and hadn't wanted. She found the first shelf of suspect parts in 4 minutes. 6 sealed boxes, cam chain tensioners, same false serial code. That's them, she said. Travis leaned in and looked. He read the number. He looked at her notepad. He looked back at the boxes. God, he said quietly. There may be more. She kept moving. Check the primary drive section. Anything with batch code 44TW. Write down the quantities. He went. She continued through the cam section. She found 3 more boxes in the back of the second shelf. These ones partially opened and restocked, which meant they'd been accessed, which meant someone knew what was in them and had been pulling from them deliberately. She photographed the boxes with her phone, the batch code, the shelf location, the quantities. She moved to the invoice files, which were kept in a metal cabinet near the door. She had filed invoices in this cabinet every week for 4 months. She knew the organization by touch. She opened the drawer for the past 90 days and started pulling folders. Travis came back. 6 more boxes in primary drive. All batch 44TW. Write down the counts. She was already into the invoices. The files were in date order. She pulled the past 60 days and started working through them, cross-referencing the false serial codes against a running list in her notepad. She was 7 folders in when she found the ledger. It was not in the invoice cabinet. It was tucked behind the invoice cabinet, in the narrow space between the metal cabinet and the wall, the kind of space that someone would only find if they were moving the cabinet, which Mara had done 3 months ago to clean behind it. She'd seen something wedged there and assumed it was an old receipt. She had replaced the cabinet without looking closely. Now she pulled it out. It was a spiral-bound ledger, the kind you bought at an office supply store. Nothing official, nothing digital. Handwritten. She opened it. The entries were in 2 columns. One column listed dates and batch codes. The other listed amounts, dollar figures, paid in cash, with initials beside each entry. The initials were NV and DE. ND, she stood very still. She knew what NV was. She'd been working for NV for 4 months. DE, Dean Ellison. The floor did not drop out from under her, but it tilted. It tilted the way the world tilts when something you were afraid of turns out to be true, not the sharp shock of the unexpected, but the nauseating confirmation of something you'd already half known and hoped you were wrong about. Dean was here. Dean's operation was here. The man who had forged her signature, destroyed her certification, and driven her out of Milwaukee had followed the same pattern, the same counterfeit components, the same false invoices, the same billing scheme into the same state where she had gone to disappear. Or she had, without knowing it, followed him. She didn't know which was worse. Mara. Travis was looking at her. He had come to stand beside her, had seen the ledger, had seen her face. Whatever he'd been about to say, he didn't say it. He looked at the ledger. He read the entries at the top of the page. He read the initials. "What is that?" She looked at him. "It's a record of payments," she said, "between the shop and the supplier, for the counterfeit parts. The initials NV is Nolan Voss." She kept her voice even. "I don't know who DE is yet." The lie came without effort, from a place she hadn't known she still had. She needed to think before she said the second name out loud, to someone she didn't trust enough yet. "I need to photograph this." She lifted her phone. The door opened. Nolan Voss stood in the doorway of the inventory room with a set of keys in his hand and an expression on his face that he was no longer bothering to arrange into anything resembling warmth. Behind him, the hallway was empty. He had not brought anyone with him. "Put the phone down, Mara," he said. She didn't put the phone down. She kept it raised, aimed at the ledger. "I'm going to have to ask you." The shutter sound. Once, twice. The flash, twice, because the lighting in the room was poor. "You just made a significant mistake," Nolan said. His voice had lost the managerial smoothness entirely. What was underneath it was flat and deliberate, and not a voice she'd heard from him before. "Whatever you think you found, you don't understand what you're looking at." "I understand exactly what I'm looking at," she said. "Batch codes, delivery dates, payment amounts, 2 sets of initials." She lowered the phone. "How long have you been buying from Dean Ellison?" Nolan's expression changed. It was subtle, the kind of change that lives in the muscle around the eyes rather than the mouth. But she'd been watching faces for a long time, and she saw it clearly. "You know him," he said. And then, 2 seconds later, slower, "You know him." "He's my brother," Mara said. "And if you're working with him, you know what he does to the people who stop being useful to him. So, whatever arrangement you think you have, I'd reconsider how well it's going to hold up when federal investigators start pulling batch codes." Travis, who had been standing 6 feet away processing, all of this with the expression of a man watching a car crash in real time, said Nolan. "What the hell?" Nolan ignored him. He was looking at Mara with an entirely new kind of attention, the attention of someone who has just realized the person they underestimated has been holding information they didn't know existed. He stepped into the room and let the door fall shut behind him. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to give me the ledger and the phone. You're going to go back to your station. And we are all going to have a very calm conversation about how to handle this in a way that doesn't blow up everyone's life in this building." "You locked 9 people into motorcycles that were going to fail on a mountain," Mara said. 2 of those tensioners were already in advanced failure. One of them had a visible fracture in the shoe. She took 1 step toward him. "There is no version of this conversation where I hand you that ledger." Nolan looked at Travis. "Travis, I need you to don't," Travis said. His voice was flat. Nolan blinked. "Don't finish that sentence," Travis said. He moved between Nolan and Mara, and the movement was not dramatic, not a hero's gesture. Not a man who had scripted this moment, just a man putting his body where his conscience finally pointed it. Awkward and too late and real. "Whatever you're about to ask me to do, don't." The 3 of them stood in the inventory room in silence for a moment that stretched longer than it had any right to. Then Mara said, "Travis, the intercom, old service system, panel next to the coolant shelf." Travis looked at her. "It connects to the bay," she said, "has since the shop was built." "Go now." Travis went. He pushed past Nolan, who reached for his arm, missed, and then made a decision, a visible decision, the kind that shows in the whole body at once, and moved toward Mara instead, reaching for the ledger. She stepped back. She held the ledger behind her with both hands. Silas. Travis's voice came through the intercom. Rough and too loud. Silas, inventory room, now. Nolan stopped moving. He stood in the center of the inventory room, with the keys still in his hand, and he looked at Mara, and what crossed his face in that moment was not anger exactly. It was the specific expression of a person who has run a long and careful calculation and arrived at a result they couldn't argue with, the look of a losing hand, recognized by someone who had played the game long enough to know the difference. You have no idea what you've started, he said. Mara looked at him steadily. I know exactly what I've started, she said. I've been on the receiving end of it. The door opened. Silas Maddox filled the frame with two Hell's Angels behind him and a look on his face that made Nolan take one involuntary step backward. Mara held out the ledger. Batch codes, delivery dates, and payment records, she said. 2 sets of initials. I've already photographed it. She looked at Silas with the directness of someone who has decided, finally, that the cost of being visible is worth paying. The second set of initials is my brother. His name is Dean Ellison. He sells counterfeit motorcycle components under falsified OEM codes, and he's been doing it for at least 6 years. He destroyed my career when I refused to sign off on his parts. She kept her voice steady. I didn't know he was operating here when I took this job. I need you to know that. Silas took the ledger. He looked at it. He looked at her. Your brother, he said. Yes. And Nolan knew who you were when he hired you? She looked at Nolan. Nolan said nothing. I don't know, she said honestly. It's possible he didn't know the connection. It's possible he did and kept me close to manage the risk. She paused. I don't know which is worse. Silas handed the ledger to the Hell's Angel on his right and looked at Nolan with the expression of a man who has come to the end of a very specific type of patience. Nolan, he said, you're going to sit down. You're going to tell me every part of this from the beginning. And you are not going to leave this building until I know everything. Because if one of my riders goes down on that mountain because of something that had your name on it, the conversation we're having right now is the best version of this situation you're ever going to see. Nolan sat down on a parts box. He sat down because there was nothing else to do, and because the man standing in the doorway was the kind of man who meant every word he said without raising his voice. And Nolan Voss, whatever else he was, had always been a person who understood when a situation had definitively changed. Mara stepped back against the shelf and held her phone, the one with the photographs, with both hands, and she breathed slowly, and she did not allow herself to feel anything about Dean Ellison yet, because that was a feeling that had years of compound interest on it, and this was not the moment for it. The moment was this: 9 motorcycles safe, the ride not yet ruined, the ledger in the hands of the right person. That was enough to keep standing for. The rest would come. Nolan talked for 40 minutes. He didn't want to. He started with the careful, selective version, the version where everything was a misunderstanding, where the supplier had mislabeled the parts, where he'd acted in good faith and been deceived just like everyone else. He ran that version for about 8 minutes before Silas set the ledger open on the parts box beside him and pointed to a specific entry without saying a word, and something in Nolan's posture changed the way a wall changes when the foundation underneath it shifts. Then he talked. The arrangement had started 2 years ago. Dean Ellison had come to him through a mutual contact in the aftermarket parts, trade a distributor who moved product through 3 states and kept his name off everything. Dean's pitch was simple: components that tested within acceptable tolerance ranges, priced at 40% below genuine OEM, invoiced and labeled to pass casual inspection. The markup that Nolan kept was significant. Not retired to Florida money, but serious money, steady money, the kind that made a mediocre year look like a good one and a good year look like an exceptional one. You knew the parts weren't safe, Silas said. Nolan looked at the floor. I knew they were outside OEM spec. I told myself the tolerance difference was. You knew, Silas said again. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The repetition was the whole point, not to confirm information, but to make sure Nolan heard himself say it. Yes, Nolan said finally. I knew. Mara was standing against the far wall with her arms crossed and her phone in her right hand, and her face doing the specific kind of stillness that people achieve when they are feeling too many things at once and have decided that none of them are available for public display. She had heard confessions before. She had heard Dean make them. Once, briefly, in a lawyer's office in Milwaukee, a partial admission designed to minimize damage rather than acknowledge truth. She knew the difference between a man confessing because he had no other option and a man confessing because he was genuinely sorry. Nolan was in the first category, but at this particular moment, his reasons didn't change the weight of what he was saying. Travis stood near the door. He had not moved much in the past 30 minutes. He was doing the internal version of what Nolan was doing, externally accounting for things. Looking at the sum, not liking the total. Silas said, "The Blue Ridge ride. You knew 9 bikes were going to be on that mountain." Nolan was quiet for too long. "Nolan, I thought the failure rate at those temperatures was..." He stopped. He pressed his hands together between his knees. "I thought it was unlikely that all of them would fail." Rooster, who had been standing in the doorway behind Silas with the particular stillness of a large man who has decided that staying still is the most productive choice available to him, said quietly, "Unlikely." The word hung in the room like something with mass. 40 riders registered for that run, Rooster said. Some of them are 60 years old. Some of them are riding 2 up with their wives. And you thought a mechanical failure on a mountain road was unlikely enough to be acceptable. Nolan didn't answer. There was no answer that would have functioned in that room. Silas turned to Mara. "What do you need to check the remaining bikes?" "Time and access," she said. "I can identify the counterfeit tensioners by the casting and serial code. If I can get the 5 remaining bikes in here today, I can work through them this afternoon. They'll be here within the hour." He looked at her with a steady, evaluating attention that she had grown accustomed to over the past several hours. "You said Dean destroyed your career. Tell me how." She had known this was coming. She had been preparing for it since the moment she'd said her brother's name out loud in this room. And she had decided, somewhere in the past 40 minutes, that the prepared version and the true version were going to be the same thing. She was done with the reduced, managed, protect yourself from pity version. She had kept that version for 2 years, and it had cost her more than the original loss. "I spent 14 years in Milwaukee," she said. "I started at a dealership right out of vocational school. I worked diagnostics, then performance builds, then started consulting on V-twin engine systems. I developed a diagnostic protocol that 2 manufacturers ended up incorporating into their standard procedure. I didn't get credit for it with my name on a document, but I knew what it was, and the people in the industry who mattered knew what it was." She paused. She was not performing this. She was simply saying what happened, in order, without decoration. "Dean came to me 7 years ago with a business proposal. A custom shop, high-end builds, performance upgrades. He had the business connections and the client network. I had the technical reputation. We were supposed to be equal partners." She looked down at her phone for a moment, then back up. 3 years in, I found out he'd been sourcing components from a supplier I'd never approved. The same class of counterfeit parts, different batch codes. Same essential problem. Undersized tolerances, inferior materials, priced and labeled as OEM. "You refused to approve them," Silas said. "I refused to approve them. I told him we needed to pull every build that had used those components, notify the customers, and absorb the cost. He told me I was being dramatic. I told him I was being a mechanic." She kept her voice level. 2 weeks later, a customer's motorcycle failed on a highway outside Madison. The rider went down, broken collarbone, road rash, no permanent injury, but it could have been worse, and we both knew it. The component that failed was one Dean had sourced without my approval. Travis said, from his position by the door, he blamed you. He had already prepared for it, Mara said. He had an email in the system sent from my address because we shared a shop account approving the supplier. He had altered the purchase order to show my sign-off. He had a statement from the supplier, confirming that the shop's technical director had reviewed and approved the batch. She let the silence hold for a second. Everything pointed to me. The customer's lawyer certainly thought so. Silas said, and you couldn't fight it. I couldn't afford to fight it the way it needed to be fought. Dean had resources I didn't. He had relationships I didn't. The legal process would have taken 2 years, and every dollar I had. And at the end of it, even if I won, my certification was already suspended pending investigation, and my professional reputation had been distributed as fact through every network I'd spent 14 years building. She unfolded her arms, looked at her hands for a moment, and put them in her pockets. I came to Tennessee because I had a contact here who offered me work. And because I needed somewhere that nobody knew my name, and I needed time to figure out what I was going to do next. She looked at Nolan. I didn't know Dean was operating here. I want to be clear about that. But now you know, Silas said. Now I know. She met his eyes. And the entries in that ledger cover 22 months of transactions. That's not a side arrangement. That's a supply chain. Dean has been running this in at least one other state I know of, Tennessee now, and I'd estimate there are others. He doesn't operate in one market. Silas picked up the ledger again. He turned to a page in the middle, read several entries, and said without looking up, how do we verify the other states? The batch codes are consistent across his operations. If investigators pull supply chain records from other shops that used batch 44TW or the adjacent codes I've identified, they'll find the pattern. Rooster stepped fully into the room. You're talking about federal. State first, probably, Mara said. Commercial fraud, consumer protection violation, potentially criminal recklessness, given the safety implications. But if the operation crosses state lines, which I believe it does, then yes, federal. The room was quiet. Silas looked at Nolan. Where is Dean Ellison right now? Nolan blinked. What? You've been in business with him for 2 years. Does he have a local presence or does he operate remotely? Nolan's expression shifted again, that small recalibration behind the eyes. He has a distribution contact in Knoxville. I've never met Dean in person. We communicated through the distributor and by phone. Phone number. Nolan. Silas's voice had dropped half a register. Phone number. Nolan gave it. Silas handed it to Rooster, who stepped out of the room with his own phone already in his hand. And Mara understood, without being told, that the Hells Angels chapter had resources and contacts that operated somewhat faster than standard investigative channels. And she made a conscious decision not to ask any questions about that particular process. She looked at Travis. I need to start on the remaining bikes. He nodded. He pushed off the wall and held the door open for her. It was a small thing, a door, held open. But it was the first time since she'd started at Iron Creek Motorworks that Travis Boone had held a door open for her, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything about it, because some acknowledgments are too large and too awkward to fit inside a sentence and have to live in actions instead. The next 3 hours were the most technically focused Mara had been in 2 years. The remaining 5 bikes arrived between 10 and 11:30, brought by riders who knew something was wrong but hadn't been told the specifics. Men who walked into the shop with the alert quiet of people who had learned to read seriousness in the way Silas Maddox made a phone call. They handed over their bikes without argument and stood back, and Mara worked through them one at a time with the systematic precision of someone who had spent a career turning disorder into diagnosis. Travis worked beside her, not directing, not supervising. Working beside her, which was a different thing entirely, and required him to occupy a position physically and otherwise that he hadn't been in before. She showed him what to look for in the casting. She showed him how the false serial code differed from the genuine one at the 4th and 5th digit. She showed him how to check the polymer shoe color and weight without a scale, using a reference component she'd pulled from sealed OEM stock. He was good. She'd always suspected he was good. She'd watched him work for 4 months, and beneath the confidence and the habit of not listening, there was genuine competence. He absorbed the identification criteria in under 10 minutes and started applying them without prompting, which was the mark of someone who actually understood what they were doing rather than someone who was following a procedure. He found the counterfeit tensioner in the third bike himself, without her guidance. He pulled it out, looked at it, compared it to the reference, and set it on the workbench lineup without saying anything. Mara looked at it. She looked at him. "Good eyes," she said. Travis nodded. He didn't have a response ready, which was unusual enough for him that it was, in itself, a kind of response. By noon, the workbench held 11 counterfeit tensioners in a row, 7 from the chapter's motorcycles, 3 from the earlier additional bikes that Mara had checked against the broader invoice records, and the original from Silas's Harley. 11 components that had been installed as genuine, billed as genuine, and would have failed, some of them, catastrophically, under the sustained load of a mountain road. Silas stood in front of that row for a long time. He didn't say anything for almost 2 minutes. The garage was not entirely quiet. There were voices from the bay entrance. 2 mechanics working on an unrelated vehicle, the distant sound of the road outside, but around Silas, there was a pocket of silence that nobody interrupted. Then he said, "Jonah would have been on this ride." The sentence landed without drama. He wasn't saying it for effect. He was saying it the way people say true things when the weight of them becomes too dense to carry internally, a release of pressure, not a performance. "He was the best rider I ever knew," Silas continued. "Better than me. Safer than me. He'd have been at the front of the pack, pushing pace on the first climb." He looked at the tensioners. If this had been 2 years ago, if this had been his bike with these parts, he stopped. Mara said nothing. There was nothing to say that would have helped, and she knew the difference between the silence that needed to be filled and the silence that needed to be honored. After another moment, Silas looked at her. "I owe you more than an apology, but I'll start with one." She looked at him steadily. "For what specifically?" "For walking into that garage 2 weeks ago and looking through you the same way everyone else did. For standing 3 feet from the person who knew what was wrong with my bike and deciding she couldn't possibly have anything useful to say." He said it plainly, without performance. "I don't make that mistake often. I made it with you." Mara held his gaze. "You didn't know me. I didn't try to know you. That's different." He paused. "My read on people is usually better than that. I've been thinking about why it wasn't." She waited. "Because you were in the wrong place," he said. "You were holding a broom. I've made that error before deciding what someone knows by where I find them. It's a lazy habit for someone who ought to know better." His jaw tightened slightly. Jonah would have had something to say about that. What would he have said? Silas almost smiled. He would have said the most dangerous kind of blind spot is the one you're too proud to notice until it costs you something you can't replace. He looked at the row of counterfeit parts. "He was smarter than me about people. He always was." Mara said quietly, "He sounds like someone worth preserving." Silas looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully categorize, something between gratitude and grief, and the particular ache of a person who's been carrying a weight alone for long enough that the offer of acknowledgement feels almost too large to accept. "Yeah," he said. He was. The moment might have held longer, but Rooster came back through the bay entrance with his phone in his hand and a look on his face that pulled everyone's attention before he said a word. "Dean Ellison," Rooster said. "The number Nolan gave us. Active cell last pinged a tower 14 miles east of here. He's not in Milwaukee. He's not in Knoxville. He's local." The garage went completely still. Mara felt the information land in her chest like something physical. Local. Dean was local. He had been 14 miles from her for how long? Weeks? Months? Had he known she was here? Had Nolan told him? She looked at Nolan, who was still sitting on the parts box in the inventory room doorway under the loose supervision of a Hell's Angels member named Cal, who had been given no specific instructions but had positioned himself in a way that made the relevant point clearly. Nolan's face confirmed it before he said anything. "When did you tell him I was working here?" Mara asked. Nolan looked at the floor. "Nolan." Her voice was quiet and precise and entirely without rage. "When?" 4 months ago, Nolan said, "when you applied for the job." 4 months ago. She had been here 4 months. He had known the entire time. He had hired her knowing, and she had spent 4 months believing she was invisible, that she had successfully disappeared into inventory, work, and anonymous labor. And all of that time, Nolan had been 14 miles from her brother and had been reporting to him, and Dean had been what? Watching, waiting, deciding? She turned away from Nolan. She did it deliberately, the way you close a door on something you're not ready to process yet. She turned back to Silas. He knows the investigation is starting, she said. If his phone was active near here this morning, he may already know about this morning. Nolan would have been in contact with him through the distributor if anything went wrong with the supply chain. Silas was already looking at Rooster. Rooster said, "We have people watching the eastern access roads. If he moves, we'll know." "I don't want him stopped," Silas said. "I want him documented. Every move, every contact. When the investigators come in, I want a complete picture." Rooster nodded and stepped back toward the entrance. Mara said, "He'll have the distribution records on his end. If he destroys them before investigators reach him, then your photos in the ledger become the primary evidence," Silas said. "Are the photos usable?" She looked at her phone. "Yes, clear enough. I photographed the batch codes, the shelf locations, the quantities, and the ledger entries in sequence, combined with the invoice records I pulled and the physical components we've removed. It's a complete chain," Travis said from across the bay. "I can document the removed components. Part numbers, condition, location of installation. I can write it as a formal shop record. It'll carry more weight than a phone photo if it comes with the mechanic's signature." Both Mara and Silas looked at him. Travis was looking at the workbench, at a row of counterfeit parts. "I should have listened to her 8 days ago," he said. "Not to either of them specifically, not performing the admission, just stating it the way you state a fact when the fact has become undeniable. I should have checked the oil return on day 8 when she told me to. If I had none of this," he stopped. "I can't undo that. But I can document this correctly, that I can do." Silas looked at Travis for a long moment. Then he said, "Do it." Travis went to the service counter and pulled out the official shop documentation forms. The next 2 hours operated on 2 tracks simultaneously. On one track, Mara and Travis worked through a formal technical record of every removed component condition, installation history, failure analysis, comparison against OEM specifications. Travis wrote in the mechanics section. Mara wrote in the technical analysis section. The document that resulted was 12 pages and would have looked, to any investigator who received it, like the product of 2 people who had been working together for years, rather than 2 people who had barely spoken a civil word in 4 months. On the other track, Silas was on his phone in the bay entrance, and the calls he was making were not to his lawyer or to the state police. They were to people who knew the kind of things that couldn't be found in public records, the distribution network that Dean Ellison had been running, the other shops in other states, the paper trail that moved between LLCs and would require a forensic accountant to follow properly, but that Silas, it turned out, had the contacts to start mapping within a matter of hours. Mara heard pieces of these calls without trying to. She kept her focus on the documentation work, but information reached her. A distribution hub in Bristol. 3 shops in Virginia identified as possible recipients of batch 44TW. A LCC name, Meridian Cycle Supply, that appeared in 2 of the conversations and that she recognized immediately with a certainty that settled into her bones as the company name on the invoices Dean had used in Milwaukee. He hadn't changed the name. He had just moved it. The arrogance of that was so characteristic of him that she felt it not as surprise but as confirmation, the same recognition she'd felt reading the ledger entries. This was how Dean operated. He didn't reinvent. He relocated. He found a new Nolan in a new city and ran the same system, and he had been running it, she now understood, for at least 6 years. 6 years of counterfeit parts in motorcycles on public roads. 6 years of riders who didn't know that the component keeping their engine alive under load was going to fail at exactly the wrong moment. She set her pen down for a moment and pressed her hands flat on the counter. Travis noticed. He kept writing, But he said quietly, "You okay calculating?" she said. "How many bikes?" She looked at him. He was asking the question she'd been avoiding, the one that lived underneath all the documentation and the evidence and the focused technical work of the past 3 hours. How many bikes in 6 years across multiple states with the same class of counterfeit component installed by shops that had no reason to question a properly labeled, properly invoiced part? "I don't know," she said honestly. "Hundreds, probably. Maybe more." Travis stopped writing. He looked at the row of components on the workbench. "And we've been using his parts here for 22 months. "Yes." "How many bikes has this shop serviced in 22 months? She had processed enough invoices to have a rough sense. 340, roughly. "I'd need to cross-reference against the batch codes to know how many received suspect components." Travis looked at her with an expression that had traveled a long way from where it had started this morning. "What do we do?" "We finish the documentation," she said. "We give everything we have to investigators with the specific skills to follow the supply chain. And we get on the phone with the shop's insurance carrier today because every customer who received an affected component needs to be notified." Travis absorbed this. "That's going to be catastrophic for the shop." "Yes," she said. "It is." She picked up her pen and went back to writing. She was on page 9 of the documentation when Rooster came through the bay entrance at a pace that was not running, but one not far from it. "He's moving," Rooster said. "Eastern Access Road, heading toward the interstate." Silas came in from the entrance immediately. "Direction?" "North. He's not running," Silas said. He looked at Mara. "If he were running, he'd go south toward Atlanta. North means Knoxville. He's going to the distributor." Mara understood immediately. "The distribution records. If he reaches them before investigators do, he destroys them," Silas said. "Or he moves them." She looked at her documentation. 8 pages complete. 4 remaining. She looked at Travis. "Can you finish this?" He looked at the remaining pages. "Yes. I'll sign it when I get back." She stood up. "The formatting in the failure analysis section needs to follow the chronological sequence I established. Don't restructure it." "I understand." She looked at Silas. "I know what the distribution records look like. I've seen Dean's filing system. If investigators arrive without someone who can identify what they're looking at, he can bury the relevant documents in administrative paperwork, and it'll take months to untangle." Silas looked at her for 1 second. Then he said, "Rooster." Rooster was already moving. What happened in the next 4 hours was not a high-speed chase, and not a confrontation, and not anything that would have made a satisfying television scene. It was something much more real, and therefore more durable, a sequence of phone calls, a coordinated arrival, a careful, documented entry by investigators who had been contacted through proper channels by someone with the kind of credibility and community standing that got calls, returned quickly, and the presence of a woman who stood in a storage facility outside Knoxville and identified, from across a room, the filing cabinet that held 2 years of distribution records for Meridian Cycle Supply. Dean Ellison was not at the storage facility when they arrived. He had been there, the facility manager confirmed. He'd come and gone 40 minutes earlier. He had taken a box of files and left the rest. Mara stood in front of the remaining filing cabinet and looked at what he'd left behind. She knew him well enough to know what he would take. First, the records that connected him directly by name, the financial transfers, the core client list. He would have left the batch records and the supplier invoices because those were one layer removed from him, connected to the shop names rather than his personal accounts. He was wrong about that. She had spent 14 years understanding how mechanical systems failed, and she had spent 2 years understanding how Dean Ellison failed, which was the same type of problem with a human face, a system that looked sound until you knew which specific thread pulled everything else apart. She pointed to a red accordion file on the second shelf. "That one," she said to the investigator beside her. "The batch code cross-reference is in there. It'll map every distribution point for every affected component across every state." The investigator pulled it. She was right. By the time they returned to Marlowe, the sun was moving through late afternoon. And the garage at Iron Creek Motor Works had taken on the particular quality of a place that has held a day's worth of revelations and is settling into the weight of them. Travis had finished the documentation. The 11 counterfeit components were photographed, labeled, and secured. Nolan Voss had given a formal statement to a state investigator who had arrived at 2 in the afternoon, and that statement had been considerably more complete than his original 40-minute version from the morning. But Mara walked back into the bay and Travis handed her the documentation. She read through the last 4 pages without sitting down. He had followed her formatting exactly. She signed it. Travis watched her sign it and said, "I owe you an apology. A real one, not a technical one." She looked up from the document. "On day 8, he said, "when you told me about the cam chest, I didn't just dismiss it. I made it into a joke afterward. With Nolan. I told him the cleaning lady was trying to run diagnostics." He held her gaze without flinching, which cost him something, and he knew it. That was wrong. It was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with whether you were right or wrong about the diagnosis. Mara looked at him for a long moment. She was looking at the quality of the apology, not the words of it the way you assess a repair, not by how it looks on the surface, but by whether the underlying work was actually done. What she saw was a man who was not apologizing to feel better, but apologizing because he understood something and couldn't understand it. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to I know," she said again. "And I accept it. Not because everything's fine, but because I've watched you work today and you're genuinely good at this, and it would be a waste if you stayed the kind of mechanic who can't hear a correct answer from the wrong person." Travis absorbed that. He nodded once. Silas came back into the bay at that point and looked at both of them, at Travis, at Mara, at the signed documentation on the counter, with the attention of a man who notices everything in a room and processes it later at his own pace. "Dean's in the wind," he said. "For now. The investigators have enough to move without him present. He'll surface." Mara nodded. She had expected this. Dean was skilled at the particular kind of disappearance that preceded a strategic reappearance. He would lawyer up, reconstruct a narrative, look for a version of events that left him adjacent to the wrongdoing rather than inside it. He had done it before. The difference this time was the ledger. The difference was 12 pages of technical documentation with 2 signatures. The difference was 11 physical components in evidence bags. The difference was a distribution record that mapped his entire operation. The difference was that, this time, someone had been in the room who knew exactly what they were looking at. Silas stood beside her and looked at the garage, at the mechanics working, at the documentation on the counter, at the row of evidence on the workbench, and said, without looking at her directly, "I want to talk about what happens to this shop after." Mara looked at him. "Nolan's done. Criminally and professionally. The shop needs management that isn't him." He paused. "I have a stake in this building. Minority but real. I've had it for 4 years because Nolan needed operating capital and I gave it to him. And now I'm wondering about the quality of that decision." "4 years ago you couldn't have known," Mara said. "No," he agreed. "But I know now." He turned and looked at her directly. "And I know what I'm looking at this time." She held his gaze. In the quality of that look was something that hadn't been there this morning, not gratitude, which was smaller, but recognition. The recognition of someone who has found, unexpectedly, a person who operates at the same frequency, in a completely different register, and has understood that this is not a coincidence to be dismissed. "I'm not interested in inheriting a corrupt shop," she said carefully. "Neither am I," he said. "I'm interested in building a different one." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward evening, and somewhere on an eastern road, Dean Ellison was making the calculations of a man who thinks he can run from the sum of his choices. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. In the garage in Marlow, Tennessee, Mara Ellison stood beside a man who had first looked through her and then had the integrity to look again, and she turned the shape of what he was proposing over in her mind like a component she hadn't inspected yet carefully, without rushing, knowing that the best assessments were the ones that took the time they needed. She didn't answer yet. But she didn't say no. She didn't answer Silas that evening. She went home to her rented room above Ruth Calder's cafe, sat at the small table by the window with a cup of coffee she didn't drink, and thought about it for 3 hours in the specific way that serious decisions deserve to be thought about, not strategically, not with a pros and cons list, but honestly, which is harder and slower, and the only method that produces an answer you can actually live with. The offer was real. She could feel the realness of it the way you feel the difference between a genuine component and a counterfeit one in the weight, in the quality of the material, in the precision of how it had been presented. Silas Maddox was not a man who made propositions he hadn't already decided to stand behind. He had said building a different one rather than taking over the existing one, and that distinction mattered to her more than she'd expected. But she had been a partner before. She had signed her name to a shared enterprise before, and she knew what it felt like when the thing you'd built with someone else became the instrument of your destruction. She sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called her former attorney in Milwaukee, a woman named Patricia Hale, who had worked her case 2 years ago and had never entirely closed the file. Patricia answered on the third ring, and Mara told her everything in 22 minutes. And Patricia was quiet for most of it and then said, "The ledger entries with your brother's initials, you have photographs of those. Clear ones. And the batch code, cross-reference from the Knoxville facility investigators have that now? Confirmed in their possession as of this afternoon." A pause. "Mara, the forged approval email, the altered purchase order. If investigators are pulling Meridian Cycle Supplies records, they're going to find the original communication trail. The one Dean built around you." Another pause. "He would have kept those records. They were his insurance." Mara understood immediately. "Insurance against me. Against you. Trying exactly what you're doing right now," Patricia said. "He kept the manufactured evidence because he needed it to be credible if you ever came back at him. But if investigators find it in his records, alongside everything else, the ledger, the batch codes, the distribution network, it doesn't look like evidence against you anymore. It looks like a file he maintained to protect himself from the woman who knew the truth." The coffee had gone completely cold. Mara looked at it. "Can you make contact with the lead investigator?" "I can make contact tonight," Patricia said. "Email me everything you photographed. Every image." And Mara, she paused in a way that carried weight. 2 years is a long time to carry this. "I want you to know that what you did today, the way you did it, that's going to matter. Not just legally. It's going to matter in the way people in this industry remember your name." Mara thanked her and ended the call and sat in the quiet for a while longer. She thought about her name. She thought about what it had meant and what it had cost and what it might mean again. She thought about a masking tape name tag on a gray work shirt and about a man who had stood beside a motorcycle in an empty garage and apologized to someone who wasn't there, and about the specific quality of courage it took to tell the truth in a room where nobody expected it from you. She picked up her phone and sent Patricia every photograph. Then she went to bed and slept better than she had in 2 years. The next morning arrived with the kind of clarity that follows a night of genuine rest, not the fragile, provisional clarity of exhaustion, but the real kind, the kind that lets you see things in their actual proportions. Mara arrived at Iron Creek Motor Works at 7:15, earlier than her official shift, and walked into a garage that had already been changed by the previous day, in ways that weren't fully visible yet, but were absolutely present. Travis was there ahead of her. He had the service records from the past 22 months spread across the main workbench, not the invoice files, which were now in investigator custody, but the shop's internal service logs, which documented every vehicle, every repair, every component installed. He had a highlighter and a notepad and the look of a man who had decided, somewhere between last night and this morning, that the accounting he needed to do was going to be done thoroughly. He looked up when she walked in. "I started cross-referencing batch codes against the service logs," he said. "Figured you'd want to know the full number." She set her bag down and looked at the spread of records. "How far did you get?" 14 months back. 93 vehicles with components from affected batches. He paused. 31 of those are bikes we haven't been able to contact yet. Some of them are out-of-state customers. 93. She had estimated hundreds across Dean's full operation, but 93 from one shop in 14 months was its own kind of staggering. These were not abstractions. They were people who had ridden out of this garage on machines with a hidden failure waiting inside them. People who had gone on vacations and commutes and charity runs and had no way of knowing. We need a customer notification system, she said. Today, every contact we have for those 93 vehicles. I know, Travis said. I also called our insurance carrier this morning. He said it the way someone says a thing they know is going to cost them directly, without flinching. They're sending an adjuster this afternoon. It's going to be bad. Yes, she said, but it's less bad than the alternative. He nodded. He already knew that. He had known it since yesterday and had called anyway, which was the relevant thing. They worked through the morning side by side, Mara on the technical identification and failure analysis, Travis on the customer records and notification drafts. The other mechanics arrived at their usual times and found a shop that had transformed overnight into something between a repair facility and an evidence management operation, with 2 people at the main bench working with a focused efficiency that made the usual morning conversation feel unnecessary. The other mechanics read the room and went to their own work without asking questions, which was its own form of respect. Marco came to the bench at 9:30 and said, "Is there something I can do?" Mara looked at him. He was 24 and had been at the shop 3 months and had, the previous morning, said 5 words publicly she did. I heard it. That had cost him something and changed the shape of everything that followed. Yes, she said. I need someone to go through the parts room and pull every sealed box in the cam drive and primary drive sections. Check batch codes against this list. She handed him the notepad with the false serial codes. Anything that matches goes on the left side of the middle shelf. Anything verified genuine goes on the right. He took the notepad. He went. By 10:30, Silas arrived. He came in the way he'd arrived the previous morning without announcement, with a particular directional certainty of a man who knew where he was going and why, but the energy around him was different, less compressed. He had made calls last night that had produced results, and the results were visible in the way he carried them. He stopped at the main bench and looked at the spread of service records. He looked at Travis's highlighted columns. He looked at Mara's failure analysis notes. He read for about 90 seconds without asking anyone to explain it to him. 93, he said. So far, Travis said, we're still working back. Silas set the records down. I spoke with the state investigator this morning. Dean was picked up at a motel in Bristol last night. He had the files he'd taken from the storage unit. Mara looked up. He lawyered up immediately, Silas said, which is what he would do. But the investigator told me they have enough in the Knoxville facility, records alone, to charge the supply chain operation without his cooperation. Dean's attorney is going to discover very quickly that the deal structure is significantly worse than his client expected. Because of the ledger, Mara said. Because of the ledger, the batch codes, the physical components, and a 12-page technical document with 2 mechanic signatures that maps every failure point. He looked at her directly. And because a woman named Patricia Hale contacted the lead investigator last night with documentation that apparently reframes the Milwaukee incident entirely. Mara said nothing. Is that your attorney? Silas asked. Former attorney, Mara said. She never officially closed the case, smart woman. Yes. Silas looked at her with the steady, evaluating attention that she had come to understand was not scrutiny, but respect the attention of a person who takes seriously the things and people they take seriously. How are you? The question was simple and direct and landed with unexpected weight because nobody had asked it in 24 hours of sustained crisis, and she hadn't noticed the absence until it was filled. I'm functioning, she said honestly. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. I know Dean is in custody, and that should feel like resolution. It doesn't yet. It feels like the first step in a very long process that I'm going to have to be present for in ways I'm not entirely prepared for. Understandable. I'm also aware, she said, that I'm standing in a garage that employed me as a cleaning assistant for 4 months, and that the primary reason anyone is listening to me now is that I fixed your motorcycle. And I'm trying to figure out how I feel about that. Silas was quiet for a moment. How do you feel about it? She thought about it honestly. Complicated. I'm glad I fixed it. I'm glad the consequences followed. I'm also aware that if your bike hadn't been here, if you hadn't been who you are, if this shop had been servicing a different kind of client, none of this would have surfaced. I would still be sweeping floors and watching parts fail and telling myself it wasn't my problem. She paused. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with. No, he agreed. It isn't. He paused. For what it's worth, I think you would have done something eventually. The notepad was already in your pocket. She almost smiled. The notepad was inventory habit. The 4 serial numbers on the notepad were not inventory habit. She conceded the point with a slight inclination of her head. Silas said, I want to bring the chapter in this afternoon. The writers, I want you to explain what you found, in your own words, directly to them. Not through me, not through a summary. Them hearing it from you matters. She looked at him carefully. Why? Because what happened here is going to travel, he said. Stories like this one always travel. And when it does, I want the version that travels to be accurate. A woman who fixed what 13 mechanics missed. A woman who found the fraud, documented it, and identified a threat to 9 riders before they got on a mountain. He looked at her steadily. I want them to know your name, your real name. Not Blondie, not the cleaning lady. Mara Ellison, who used to build diagnostic systems for V-twin engines in Milwaukee, and who has been working in our shop for 4 months without anyone bothering to find that out. The garage was quiet for a moment. Travis had stopped writing. Marco had appeared in the doorway of the parts room, holding a parts box. Mara said, if I'm going to stand in front of your chapter and explain a technical failure chain, I'd prefer to have the complete customer notification list finished first. 93 people are more urgent than 30 riders who already know something happened. Silas looked at her. Something in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, the adjustment of a person encountering someone who consistently prioritizes differently than expected, settled into what she was coming to recognize as his version of approval. Fair, he said. Finish the list. We'll do it at 4. He pulled up a stool at the end of the bench and said, what do you need? Mara looked at him for a second. Then she handed him the stack of service records she hadn't reached yet. Start from the bottom. Vehicle type, service date, batch codes if the invoice reference appears. 3 columns. He took the records and started reading. For the next 2 hours, Silas Maddox, chapter president of the Hells Angels, a man whom half the county treated with the careful deference reserved for weather and geography, sat at a workbench in a motorcycle shop and did data entry. He didn't perform it, and he didn't make a point of it. He just did it, column by column, with the focused attention of someone who had decided this was where his effort was most useful. And that was that. Marco, watching from the parts room doorway for about 30 seconds, went back to his own work without saying anything. But when he came to the bench 20 minutes later with the completed parts sort, he set the notepad down in front of Mara, rather than waiting to be asked, and he told her the count clearly and completely. And she thanked him by name for the first time in 4 months. He stood a little straighter when he walked back to the parts room. Small things, they accumulate. By noon, the customer list was complete. 107 vehicles total, spanning 22 months, with components from affected batch codes, confirmed in service records. Travis drafted a notification letter, factual, clear, apologetic without being legally evasive, and Mara reviewed it and made 4 specific changes that tightened the technical language and added a direct instruction for customers to bring their vehicles in for inspection at no charge with a specific time frame. Travis read her revisions. He made no argument about any of them. He sent the letter to print. The insurance adjuster arrived at 1:15 and spent 45 minutes with the service records and the documentation Mara and Travis had prepared. And when she left, her expression carried the particular quality of someone who has seen the full scope of a situation and is already calculating what it means for the people above her. She said she would be in contact by end of week. She shook Mara's hand when she left, which she had not done when she arrived. At 3:30, the Hells Angels riders began arriving. They came in groups of 2 and 3, parking in the lot outside, and coming through the bay entrance with the settled, deliberate energy of people who had been told something serious had happened and were here to understand it fully. There were 22 of them by the time Silas called the gathering. They ranged in age from 29 to 67. And they were not a uniform group in any visible sense, except the patches. They wore men and women who had accumulated their years differently, carried them differently, and were looking at Mesherer and Ellen with 22 variations of the same fundamental question. Silas said simply, "This is Mara Ellison. She works here. She's going to tell you what she found." He stepped back. Mara stood in front of 22 Hells Angels and told the technical story the way she would have told it to a room of engineers, clearly, precisely, without condescension and without simplification, because she had learned over 14 years that people who work with machines understand mechanical truth when it's given to them straight. She showed them the removed tensioner from Silas's bike. She explained the failure sequence, the heat threshold, the composite degradation, the debris in the oil passage, the 7-second interval. She explained how she'd identified the counterfeit serial code and what it told her about the supply chain. She walked them through the 4 bikes that had been at critical risk for the Blue Ridge ride. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody asked a question that was designed to test her rather than understand her. When she finished, a woman in the back early 50s, gray streak in dark hair, who had been in the second group to arrive, said, "My bike was one of the 4? "Yes," Mara said. "The tensioner we removed from your cam drive had a visible center fracture. It was the most advanced failure of the group." The woman was quiet for a moment. "I ride 2 up with my daughter on the charity runs." "I know," Mara said. "That's why we checked it first." The woman nodded once, slowly, and said nothing else. But the quality of her silence was different from the silence before Mara had spoken. Rooster said, "You've been working here 4 months." "Yes." "Sweeping floors and inventory." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "You sat on the knowledge about the tensioner for 8 days because Travis told you to stay in your lane." Travis, standing at the back of the group, said, "That's accurate. Why didn't you go over his head?" Rooster asked Mara. "To Nolan?" She looked at him. "Because Nolan told me on day 1 to stay out of the mechanics work. And because I had no standing in this shop and no credibility in this town and no professional certification on record because my brother had taken it, and the only job I had was the one I was at risk of losing if I made a problem of myself." She paused. "I made the calculation that staying quiet was safer. I was wrong about that, and I knew I was wrong every day I made it, and I'm not proud of it." The honesty of it landed in the room in a way that a more polished version wouldn't have. These were people who could smell a managed answer from a distance, and what she had given them was the unmanaged one. A man near the front, heavy-set, 50 or so, a road name she didn't know stitched on his cut, said, "What changed? On the night you fixed it?" She looked at him. "I heard Silas apologize to a man who wasn't there," she said, "for not being able to protect something that belonged to both of them." She paused. "I knew that feeling, and I decided the cost of staying invisible was higher than the cost of being wrong." The room was quiet. Silas, from the side of the group, said nothing. But he was looking at her with the expression of a man, hearing something he'd suspected but hadn't heard confirmed. And it sat on him the way true things sit, without drama, without performance, just wait. The woman with the gray streak said, "What's your brother going to do now? With the lawyers?" "He's going to look for a version of this that reduces his exposure," Mara said. "He's very good at finding those versions. But the evidence chain this time is complete enough that the best version available to him is still going to be significant criminal liability. He won't get out of this cleanly. Will you?" The question came from a different direction, a younger man, late 20s, who had been listening from the edge of the group with the focused quiet of someone who asks few questions and makes them count. Mara looked at him. Get out of it cleanly? Your certification. Your reputation. The stuff he took from you. She thought about Patricia Hale's call the previous night, about the photographs, about the distribution records in investigator custody, about the forged approval email that Dean had kept as insurance, and that was now evidence of his method rather than her guilt. Partially, she said honestly. The legal record can be corrected. The professional certification process can be reopened with the new evidence. What he did to relationships, the people in the industry who believed the version he distributed, that takes longer. Some of them won't revise their opinion, regardless of what the record shows, because it's easier to maintain a first impression than to rebuild one. She paused. I've made my peace with that part. The young man nodded. He seemed satisfied with the honest answer in a way that a reassuring one wouldn't have achieved. Travis stepped forward from the back of the group. He did it with the deliberate body language of someone who has rehearsed a decision and is executing it despite the discomfort. I want to say something, he said. The group looked at him. I've been lead mechanic here for 4 years, he said. I know most of you. You've trusted this shop with bikes that matter to you, bikes that keep you safe on roads where safe matters a lot. He paused. On day 8 of Silas's repair, Mara told me exactly where the problem was. She told me the failure sequence, the location, and the approach to verify it. I dismissed her because she was holding a broom, and I was holding a scanner, and I had decided, without examining that decision at all, that the scanner meant I knew more. He looked at the group without looking away. I was wrong about that in a way that had real consequences. 9 bikes. A mountain road. I need you to know that I know that. The room was quiet. Nobody said it's okay, because it wasn't entirely okay. And Travis had not asked them to say it was. He had stated a fact about himself in a room full of people it mattered to, and he had accepted the silence that followed as the appropriate response. That took more than the words had. Rooster said, "What happens to this shop now?" Silas looked at Mara. She had been thinking about this since last night. Since the quiet 3 hours at the table with the cold coffee. Since the decision she'd turned over carefully enough to know its actual weight. That depends on whether the people in this room think it's worth saving, she said. She looked at the group directly. Nolan built something here that was functional in its basics. The equipment is good. The space is adequate. The customer base is real. What he corrupted was the supply chain and the culture. Both of those can be corrected, but it takes more than new management. It takes accountability that's visible and consistent, not just announced. She paused. I'm not interested in running a shop where I'm the person everyone defers to because of one good day. I'm interested in running a shop where the standard is what it should have been from the start: verified parts, honest invoices, and the understanding that the person who knows the answer to a problem gets to give it, regardless of what they were doing when they figured it out. Silence. Then the woman with the gray streak said, "What do you need from us?" "Your business," Mara said simply. "Brought back through the door on the understanding that you'll hold us to that standard. If an invoice doesn't look right, you say so. If a repair takes longer than it should, you ask why. If someone in this shop dismisses a question because of who's asking it, you don't let that stand." She looked around the group. The shop only stays honest if the people it serves expect honesty. That's not a speech. That's how it actually works. The woman nodded. All right. Others nodded. Not everyone. A few of the men near the back remained neutral, which was honest and appropriate and better than false agreement. Those ones would make up their minds based on what they saw over the next months, and that was exactly right. Silas said the Blue Ridge ride. It was postponed, not canceled. Everyone looked at him. "I want to reschedule it for 3 weeks from now," he said. "Same route, same charity beneficiary. Expanded registration. I want to open it beyond the chapter." He paused. "And I want the starting point to be here." He looked at Mara when he said it. Not with the expectation of her agreement. He'd learned enough about her in 36 hours to know that approach wouldn't work, but with the question in it. The real question underneath the proposal. She considered it for a moment. 3 weeks. The shop not yet restructured, the criminal proceedings just beginning, the customer notification process still in motion, her professional recertification not yet filed. 3 weeks was not enough time to do anything perfectly. It was enough time to do something real. 3 weeks, she said. But I want one condition. Name it. Every motorcycle registered for that ride gets a pre-departure inspection. Here, free of charge, verified components only. She looked at the group. Not because I think there are more bad parts out there. Because that's what a shop that wants to be trusted does. It shows its work before it asks people to stake their lives on it. The room was quiet for a beat. Then Rooster said, "How many bikes are we talking?" Open registration. Could be 200. Could be more. He looked at Travis. "Can you do that in 3 weeks?" Travis looked at Mara. "Can we?" She thought about it. The staff they had. The time available. The scope of a proper pre-departure inspection for 200 motorcycles, not the abbreviated version, but the real one that the situation demanded. "We'll need 2 additional certified technicians," she said, "temporarily. And I'll need Marco on full-time inspection support. He's fast, and he learns quickly." She paused. "And I'll need to be in the shop from 6 in the morning." "You're already in the shop from 6 in the morning," Travis said. "Then nothing changes," she said. The first real laugh in 36 hours moved through the group, not the forced kind. Not the relief kind, but the real kind that comes when tension breaks against something genuinely unexpected. Even Silas smiled. It was a small smile, contained, but it reached his eyes, and Mara filed it in the part of her memory that kept the things worth keeping. The group stayed another hour. They came to the bench individually or in pairs and looked at the counterfeit components still laid out under the workbench light, and they asked specific questions and got specific answers, and by the time they left, the understanding of what had been found and how and by whom had passed through every one of them in the particular way that genuine information travels not as a story performed for them, but as a fact they had examined themselves. When the last of them left, the garage held only Travis, Marco, Mara, and Silas. Marco was sweeping. He had picked up the broom without being asked, not because it was assigned to him, but because it was there and needed doing, and he was the one who noticed. He swept with the uncomplicated focus of a young man who had not yet learned to attach meaning to physical tasks, which meant he hadn't yet learned to feel diminished by them either. Mara watched him for a moment. Travis said quietly, from the bench beside her, "He's going to be good." "Yes," she said. "He is." Silas said, "I'll have the partnership paperwork drafted by Friday." Mara looked at him. "I haven't agreed to the partnership." "No," he said. "But you described the shop you want to build in enough detail to someone else's chapter that you've essentially committed to it publicly, which is the kind of thing that happens when someone has already decided and is waiting for the last specific condition to resolve." She looked at him for a long moment. "What's the last condition?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "The shop's name," she said. "Nolan's name comes down. Whatever goes up is not a compromise between what this shop was and what it could be. It's a statement of what it's going to be." Silas nodded. "That's your call entirely." She looked at the garage, at the workbenches and the equipment and the space that had held 4 months of her invisible labor and 1 day of her visible truth. She thought about a name. She had one. She had had it since last night, sitting at the table with the cold coffee, when she'd understood that the thing she was building was not a reclamation of what had been taken from her in Milwaukee. It was something different, something that belonged to here, to now, to the specific combination of people and events and choices that had produced this moment. She didn't say it yet. She would say it on Friday when the paperwork was ready and the decision was official, and the words would mean what they were supposed to mean. But she knew what it was. And for the first time in 2 years, she knew exactly where she was going. The name came to her at 5:40 on Friday morning. She had been awake since 4:30, lying in the dark of her room above Ruth's cafe with the before wakefulness of someone whose mind had already started the day before their body agreed to it. She wasn't anxious. That surprised her. She had expected anxiety, had prepared for it, had rehearsed calm responses to the internal arguments she'd anticipated making against herself. But what was actually there, in the quiet before the alarm, was something she hadn't felt in so long, that it took her a moment to identify it correctly. Certainty. Clean, undefended certainty. The kind that doesn't need to argue with itself. She got up, made coffee, and sat at the table by the window. She took out the notepad, the same kind she'd used for inventory, the same kind she'd used to write down 4 serial numbers that changed everything, and she wrote 2 words on the top line. She looked at them for a while. Then she got dressed and went to work. Patricia Hale called at 8:15. While Mara was at the main bench reviewing the pre-inspection protocol she'd built for the charity ride. Patricia's voice had the compressed, careful quality of a lawyer managing news that was significant in multiple directions at once. The investigators pulled Meridian Cycle Supply's complete filing system from the storage unit, Patricia said. The box Dean took contained the financial transfer records, his personal cut from each transaction. He thought taking those would protect him. What he left behind was everything else, including a complete communication archive going back to the original Milwaukee operation. Mara set down her pen, the forged approval email, in the archive, with metadata showing it was created and inserted into the chain 3 days after the customer's accident in Madison, not before after. A pause. He didn't forge it preemptively, Mara. He built it as a response to the accident, which means it was constructed specifically to redirect blame after the fact, and the metadata proves it. The garage was noisy around her, Travis running an engine test in Bay 2, Marco on the phone with a parts supplier. The sound of the street coming in through the open service entrance. Mara heard none of it. "That's enough to reopen the certification proceeding," she said. "That's enough to close it," Patricia said. "In your favor. The Tennessee investigator is coordinating with the Wisconsin Licensing Board directly. I've already submitted the photographic evidence from the shop and the technical documentation you and Travis prepared. The board is convening an emergency review." Another pause, smaller this time. "I think you should be prepared for this to move faster than you expect." "How fast?" "Weeks, not months." Patricia's voice shifted slightly, a warmth underneath the professional precision. "You built a complete evidentiary record in 1 day. Mara, most fraud cases take investigators months to piece together what you handed them in 24 hours. That's not going unnoticed." Mara looked at the notepad on the bench, at the 2 words on the top line. "Thank you, Patricia. Don't thank me. You did the work. I just filed the paperwork." A brief pause. "What are you going to do now?" "Today, pre-inspection protocols for 200 motorcycles." She picked up her pen, "And I'm going to give a shop a new name." She ended the call and looked up to find Travis standing at the end of the bench, with a coffee in each hand and an expression that said he'd heard enough of the conversations to understand the direction of it. He set 1 coffee in front of her without asking if she wanted it. "Good news," he said. "The metadata on the forged email," she said. "It was created after the accident, not before." Travis was quiet for a moment. "So he built the evidence against you after the fact?" "Yes." "And that's provable now?" "Yes." Travis looked at his coffee. He looked at the bench. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who is doing the math on what that means, not just legally, but in terms of what it says about 2 years of a person's life spent carrying something they should never have been asked to carry. "Good," he said. It was a short word, and he said it with a weight that made it longer. "Then Silas is coming at 10 for the signing. The attorney's bringing 3 copies. "I know." She looked at the notepad. "I have the name." He looked at the notepad from across the bench. He couldn't read it from that angle, but he didn't try to. "Does Silas know?" "He said it was my call entirely. Is it what I'd expect?" She thought about that. "Probably not," she said. "But it's right." He nodded and went back to Bay 2. And the morning continued around her, with the productive noise of a garage that had found its direction. Silas arrived at 10 o'clock with a man named Gerald Park, an attorney who wore a good suit and carried a leather document folder and had the professional composure of someone who had witnessed a wide range of human situations and had learned to bring the same even manner to all of them. Gerald set 3 copies of the partnership agreement on the service counter cleared for the occasion, the first time in Mara's memory that the counter had been fully cleared, and stepped back to let the principals review them. Mara read every page. This was not performance or caution. It was the habit of someone who had once failed to read carefully enough what was being attributed to her name, and who had no intention of carrying that particular lesson lightly. Silas watched her read. He did not rush her. On page 7, she found the name field blank, awaiting their decision. She read the surrounding language carefully. The partnership structure was equal, 50% each, with operating decisions requiring mutual agreement on matters above a defined threshold. Below that threshold, each partner had autonomous authority within their respective domains. Silas on the business and community relationship side, Mara on the technical and operational side. The structure was clean. It was the structure of people who had thought carefully about where they were the same and where they were different, and had built the agreement around both, rather than pretending one didn't exist. She looked up. Page 11, Section 4. The Parts Verification Clause. Gerald said, "Yes? I want to add language requiring that any component above $20 in cost be verified against the manufacturer's current authentic database before installation, not just against the invoice. And that the verification record be attached to the customer's service documentation permanently." Gerald made a note. "That's addable. Any other changes?" One more. She turned to page 14. The Apprenticeship Clause. "I wanted to specify that candidates from non-traditional backgrounds, people without conventional credentials who demonstrate technical competency, are explicitly eligible. I don't want the eligibility language to default to certification requirements that can exclude people with practical skill." Gerald looked at Silas. Silas said, "Add it." Gerald made the note. "I'll have amended copies ready this afternoon. If you're both comfortable, we can do the formal signing then." "We're comfortable," Silas said. Mara said the name. Gerald opened his notepad. "Whenever you're ready." She took the inventory notepad from her pocket and pushed it across the counter to Silas. He looked at the 2 words she'd written at 5:40 that morning. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up at her. His expression was not what she'd expected, not surprise, not negotiation, but something simpler and more complete. Recognition. The specific recognition of a person who sees in someone else's choice a quality that confirms what they already believed about them. Ellison Maddox. She had not written. She had written, "Verified Motorworks." "Not your name," Silas said. It was not a criticism. "My name's already on the work," she said. "It's on the documentation, on the technical analysis, on the record that cleared the fraud. Anyone who needs to know what I did here will find it." She looked at him steadily. "But the shop shouldn't be named after what I survived. It should be named after what it promises to do." She paused. "Verified parts, verified repairs, verified people. That's what we're building. The name should say that from the front." Silas looked at the notepad for another moment. Then he said, "Gerald, the name is Verified Motorworks." Gerald wrote it down. The 3 weeks that followed were the hardest and most productive Mara had been through since the last winter she'd spent in Milwaukee, building something she believed in. The pre-inspection program for the charity ride took everything the shop had. Mara working from 6 in the morning, Travis running parallel inspection bays, Marco developing into a technical assistant faster than anyone had predicted, and 2 contracted certified technicians brought in for the 3-week period who arrived skeptical and left having seen enough that their skepticism had converted into something more useful. 187 motorcycles came through the shop in 19 days. Not 200, 187. Because the registration had grown beyond the original's Hell's Angels chapter and pulled in riders from 4 surrounding counties who had heard, through the channel, that serious information travels in close communities, that something significant had happened in Marlow, and that the shop doing the pre-ride inspections was not the same shop that had been there a month ago. They found 3 additional suspect components across the 187 bikes, not from batch 44 TW, which had been fully traced and removed from circulation, but from a related supplier batch that Mara identified through a slight variation in the false serial coding. It was a variation she recognized because she had spent 3 days in the second week studying the distribution records the investigators had shared with her as a technical consultant and she had learned the full scope of Dean's coding system well enough to identify its variants. She reported the 3 components to the investigators immediately. The find extended the scope of the criminal case and added 2 more shops in Virginia to the investigation. Dean's attorney, she learned from Patricia, had stopped trying to find a favorable version of events by the end of the second week. The metadata evidence on the forged email, combined with the distribution records and the physical components chain, had produced a situation with no favorable version. The attorney was now negotiating the least favorable version, which was a substantially different exercise. Mara didn't spend much time thinking about Dean during those 3 weeks. She had 2 years thinking about Dean, and she had found that the more useful she became in the present, the less space the past required. It didn't disappear, she knew it wouldn't disappear, but it found its correct proportion. Something that had happened, rather than something that was still happening. On the morning of the rescheduled Blue Ridge Brotherhood ride, she arrived at the shop at 5:30. She was not the first one there. Travis was already at the bench, running a final check on Silas's Harley, which had been in for a full service in the week before the ride, not because it needed it, but because it deserved it. He had done the work himself, with Mara reviewing every stage, and the resulting service record was 12 pages and contained no ambiguities and had been filed under both their names. Marco was restocking the supply room, organizing the inspection tags for the morning's final pre-ride walkthrough, moving with the efficient ease of someone who had found their rhythm in a space they'd claimed. Ruth Calder arrived at 6 with a tray of coffee and 24 of the biscuits she made on special occasions, and she set them on the cleared service counter without ceremony and said, "I figured you'd all be here already." And nobody contradicted her because she was entirely right. Ruth was 61 and had known pieces of Mara's past, from the beginning not the full story, which Mara had given her gradually and in the order it was ready to be given, but enough to understand the shape of what Mara had carried into Marlowe and what it had cost to carry it. She had never offered unsolicited advice and had never performed sympathy in a way that required Mara to perform gratitude in return, which were the 2 qualities Mara valued most in another person and which were considerably rarer than they should have been. Ruth handed Mara a coffee and said, "How are you?" "Ready," Mara said. Ruth looked at her for a moment with the specific attention of someone who has known a person through a transition and is taking the honest measure of where they've arrived. "Yes," Ruth said, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "You are." Silas arrived at 7:15. He came through the service bay entrance and stopped. The shop had changed. Not dramatically, the equipment was the same. The layout was the same. The physical bones of the building were identical to what they'd been for 15 years. But the name above the service entrance was new, installed 3 days ago by a sign company that Mara had paid for out of the operating account they'd opened jointly the week before. The letters were clean and plain and direct. Verified Motorworks. No logo, no tagline, no graphic element that tried to be more than what it was. Just the promise, stated as fact. Silas looked at it for a moment. He had seen it before he'd been there when it went up. But this morning, with the ride starting in 2 hours and the shop full of people and coffee and purpose, it had a different quality. It looked like something that had always been there. Something that had been there before the building and would be there after. He came to the bench and stood beside Mara and Travis and said, "How many registered for today?" 412, Mara said. "It grew through this week. Some of them are coming from North Carolina." 412 motorcycles, Travis said. He said it with the specific wonder of a man running the inspection math and finding it satisfying. "Pre-ride walkthrough starts at 8:30, Mara said. "I moved it up. I want 90 minutes of buffer before departure." Travis nodded. "Marco and I can handle the primary lanes. You and the contracted techs take the detailed inspections on anything that flags." That's the plan. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to say something to the riders before we depart. All of them. Mara looked at him. I want them to know what happened here, he said. Not the fraud, they know about that already. I want them to know the full account. The 14 days, the 13 mechanics, the diagnostic scanner in the wrong port, the woman with the broom and the stethoscope in the bottom of her bag. He looked at her steadily. And I want them to hear it the way I tell it, which is as a story about what happens when an entire room stops listening and what it costs. She held his gaze. You don't need my permission for that. No, he agreed. But I wanted you to know beforehand, so it wasn't a surprise. She thought about it. About 412 riders who would hear her name before they got on their motorcycles. About the version of her that a story becomes when it passes through other people, inevitably simplified, inevitably shaped by the teller, carrying the essential truth or missing it, depending on what the teller understood about why it mattered. Silas, she had come to understand over 3 weeks of working beside him, understood exactly why it mattered. Tell it accurately, she said, including the part where I waited 8 days. That part stays in, he said. It's the most important part. She looked at him. Why? Because it tells people what invisible costs, he said. Not just the person who's been made invisible. Everyone in the room pays for it. In this case, almost with their lives. He paused. If you'd been heard on day 8, the fraud would have surfaced 10 days earlier. The distribution records would have been harder to move. Dean would have had less time to prepare. He held her gaze. Being ignored has a price that the people doing the ignoring almost never have to calculate. I want 400 people on motorcycles to think about that before they ride. Mara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the 14 years before Marlowe, about the rooms she'd walked into and the volume she'd learned to lower, about the specific arithmetic of deciding how much of yourself to make available to people who might not receive it well, and what that arithmetic extracted from you over time. All right, she said. Tell it. The morning moved with the particular momentum of a large, coordinated event that has been properly prepared for not the frantic energy of improvisation, but the clean, purposeful energy of systems working as designed. The pre-ride inspection ran in 4 parallel lanes, each with a certified technician and a documentation assistant. 112 motorcycles in the first wave, starting at 8:30. Travis ran lane 1 with the focused efficiency of a mechanic who had rebuilt his professional identity around precision in the past 3 weeks. Marco ran lane 2 with the developing confidence of someone discovering that he was considerably better at this than the people around him had previously credited. The contracted technicians ran lanes 3 and 4, following the inspection protocol Mara had written, which was the most thorough pre-ride verification procedure any of them had encountered, and which they had stopped finding excessive by the end of the first week. Mara floated. She checked everything that flagged, answered every question that needed a deeper answer, and moved through the lanes with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this, had stood in a space like this, with machines and people, and the specific responsibility of getting things right for long enough that it had become the truest version of herself. Nothing failed inspection that shouldn't have failed. 2 bikes had unrelated issues: a worn front brake pad on a vintage Sportster, a loose spoke on a touring bike, and their owners were pulled aside and given honest assessments and options. Both chose to address the issues before riding. Both thanked the technician who told them. That was the thing that accumulated through the morning. In a way, Mara hadn't fully anticipated the gratitude. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that required a response. The quiet kind. The kind that appeared in how people shook hands, in how they talked to their technician while their bike was being checked. In the woman who had ridden 2 hours from North Carolina, and who, when she picked up her inspection tag and was told everything checked out, said simply, I heard about what happened here. I wanted to come to this shop specifically. By 10:30, the full 412 motorcycles had been inspected and cleared. Mara stood at the end of the last inspection lane and looked at the number, the actual physical reality of 412 machines that had been checked by verified people against verified standards, documented, and cleared for a mountain road, and she felt something she recognized as satisfaction, which was different from pride and considerably harder to manufacture. Silas gathered the riders at 11. 412 motorcycles. 431 riders, some running two up, the woman with the gray streak and her daughter. Others who had brought friends or partners on the back. They gathered in the lot outside Verified Motorworks and overflowed down the adjacent street, and the sound of that many engines at idle was something that existed below hearing and above it simultaneously, a vibration that lived in the chest rather than the ears. Silas stood at the front of the group and spoke without amplification, which should not have worked at that scale. And somehow the crowd had gone quiet enough, and his voice had the carrying quality of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. He told the story. He told it the way he'd said he would, accurately, including the 8 days, including the scanner in the wrong port, including the masking tape name tag and the comment about men's work, and the specific moment when a correct holding answer to a man who had already decided not to receive it. He told it without theater and without simplification. And the 431 people listening to him were the specific demographic for whom this made the most weight, people for whom this story had enough years in the world to have been on one side or the other of that particular dynamic, or both, and who understood without being told what it cost. When he finished, he turned to Mara, who was standing to his left. He said, "Who fixed my Harley?" It was the same question, the same 4 words. But the silence that followed them was not the silence of a room deciding where to point. It was the silence of 431 people who already knew the answer and were waiting to honor it. Mara stepped forward. The response that moved through the crowd was not cheering, exactly. It was something more complex and more honest than cheering. The sound of a large group of people exhaling a recognition simultaneously. Some of them clapped. Some of them called her name. Some of them, she noticed, were just looking at her with the steady, considered attention of people who had heard a true thing and were deciding how to carry it. She looked at them and said, "Thank you. Now let's make sure everyone gets home." It was the right note because it was the true note, not deflection, not false modesty, but the priority stated plainly. The ride mattered. The 431 people on those motorcycles mattered more than the story about how the inspection happened. Silas, beside her, made a sound that she identified after a moment as a quiet laugh. The genuine kind. She turned to look at him. "Jonah would have liked you," he said. She held that for a moment. It was not a small thing. She had learned enough about Jonah Reyes over 3 weeks of working beside Silas to understand that his regard was the highest standard Silas applied to people. It was not a compliment given casually. "I think I would have liked him," she said. Silas nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced something she hadn't seen him carry before, a single key on a plain ring. He held it out to her. She looked at it. "The Harley," he said. "For today. I want you to lead the ride." She looked at the key. She looked at him. "You restored her," he said, Ed. "You understood what she meant before I told you. You ought to ride her at least once." He paused. "And I want the person who leads 400 motorcycles up the Blue Ridge today to be the person who made it possible for 400 motorcycles to be there safely." She took the key. She turned it over in her hand. The weight of it was different from what she expected, not heavier, but more specific. It was the weight of something that had been held by someone who loved it for a long time. And that kind of weight doesn't live in the object. It lives in the knowledge of what the object carries. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and produced a key of her own. Silas looked at it. "What's that?" "Come here," she said. She walked him to the side of the building where, covered by a shop tarp she'd borrowed with Ruth's help the previous evening, sat the motorcycle she had been building in the back of the shop for 3 weeks. Not from the floor up, she hadn't had 3 weeks for that, but from a 1987 Harley Sportster that had come in for service 2 months ago and been abandoned by its owner without payment. She had paid the storage fee herself, negotiated the title, and spent every hour between 7 and midnight for 19 days bringing it back. She pulled the tarp. It was not Silas's Harley, and it was not trying to be. It was smaller, leaner, finished in a dark metallic blue that she had chosen because it was the color of the hour before dawn, the color of the light she'd been working in when she'd made the decision, finally, about what she was building and why. Every component was verified OEM. Every repair was documented. It was not a showpiece. It was a working motorcycle built by someone who knew exactly what working meant. Silas stood there for a moment. "You built this in 3 weeks," he said. 19 days, she said, which is why the paint is still curing slightly on the left panel. She looked at it with the honest eye of a builder. "I'll touch it up next week." He looked at her. "You're not riding behind me." "No," she said. "I'm not." He understood. He had understood since the day in the inventory room when she'd said she didn't want to inherit something corrupt. She wanted to build something real. The motorcycle was the physical version of that statement. She wasn't here because someone had rescued her. She was here because she had done the work, and it had brought her to this road. Silas put the key to his Harley back in his pocket. He smiled fully. This time, not the small, contained version, but the real one. The one that belonged to a man who had spent 18 years carrying his grief carefully, and had just discovered that carrying it carefully had brought him here, to this morning, to this particular quality of possibility. "Then let's ride," he said. The departure was something that Mara would not find adequate words for afterward. And she was not a person who ran out of words easily. 412 motorcycles leaving Marlow in a sequence that stretched for half a mile. The sound of it, the scale of it, the specific feeling of being at the front of something that large and knowing that the reason it was moving safely was because of work done in the dark, with a stethoscope and a notepad, and the decision to stop pretending that being invisible was the same as being safe. She rode Silas's Harley. She had accepted it, after all, for the first leg, because it was right and she knew it was right. And one of the things she had learned in 3 weeks of building something new was that accepting what was offered generously was not the same as owing what couldn't be repaid. After the first 30 miles, at the first overlook stop, she switched to her own bike. Nobody made a ceremony of it. Travis, riding in the third row, saw it happen and nodded once. Marco, riding for the first time on a motorcycle he'd borrowed from one of the chapter members who'd taken a liking to him over 3 weeks of honest work, didn't notice because he was focused on the road, which was exactly right. The woman with the gray streak, whose name was Diane, pulled alongside Mara at the second overlook and rode beside her for the next 40 miles without saying anything, which was the kind of company that Mara had always valued most: present, steady, not requiring anything from the silence. The mountain section of the Blue Ridge route was everything the terrain description had suggested, and then more. The climbs were sustained and steep, the throttle demand consistent, the temperature of the engines rising to exactly the range that a counterfeit tensioner would have failed in, on exactly these curves, with exactly this exposure on the downhill side. Mara felt the Harley, her Harley, the one she had built, perform under load with the smooth, even response of a machine that had been put together correctly. And the satisfaction of that was deeply physical. It lived in her hands, on the bars, and her legs against the tank, and the even sound of an engine that had nothing to hide. At the summit overlook, the same one that Silas had mentioned Jonah visiting, years before the riders stopped. It was not a planned stop. It had not been in the route schedule. But Silas slowed and pulled over, and the riders behind him followed, the way a river follows a redirected channel, naturally and without confusion, because the person at the front was moving with intention, and intention has its own gravity. He stopped. He cut his engine. 412 engines went quiet behind him. He stood at the overlook rail and looked out at the mountains, and Mara pulled up beside him and did the same. And the silence that followed was the kind that belonged to a place old and geographic and indifferent to human scale in a way that made human things feel appropriately sized. After a moment, Silas said, "He stood right here. Last time we came up," he paused. He said, "You know what I love about this view?" I asked what. He said, "It doesn't care about anything we think matters." A pause. He was right. He was almost always right about things like that. Mara said nothing. She looked at the mountains. I've been coming back here every year, Silas said, trying to hold on to what it felt like to stand here with him. He was quiet for a moment. I think I've been confusing remembering with holding on. They're not the same thing. No, she said. They're not. Holding on is looking backward, he said. Remembering is carrying something forward. He turned and looked at her. He would have told me the difference years ago if I'd been listening. She looked at him. Maybe you needed to find it yourself. Maybe, he said. Or maybe I needed to end up in a situation where someone else showed me what it looked like. Someone who had things taken from her and decided to carry them forward instead of spending the civil life trying to get back to before. She held that. She thought about the years between Milwaukee and Marlowe, about the contracted, defended way she'd existed in them, the careful smallness, the managed invisibility, the perpetual calculation of how much of herself was safe to present, about how she had told herself this was survival strategy rather than loss, and about the morning in Ruth's room when she'd looked at the notepad with 2 words on it and understood that the survival strategy had been its own kind of surrender. I wasn't always moving forward, she said honestly. No, he said, but you were when it counted. The ride down the mountain was different from the ride up in the specific way that completion is different from effort lighter, more open, the work already done. 412 motorcycle descending in the afternoon light, with the particular collective ease of a large group of people who have shared something meaningful and are now carrying it individually in the ways that individuals carry shared things. The charity total was announced at the post-ride gathering in Marlowe, 412 registrations at the revised fee, plus donations collected at the Overlook, stopped by riders who had passed a hat on their own initiative. The sum was more than double the previous year's total, which had been run without incident and without anyone nearly dying on a mountain. The beneficiary organization, a fund supporting independent mechanics who had been displaced by workplace discrimination or fraudulent certification proceedings, received the check at 6 o'clock, and the woman who accepted it on behalf of the organization said, in her remarks, that the story of what had happened in Marlowe had already reached her organization before the check had, and that it was the kind of story they needed more of, because stories about the right thing happening were considerably rarer in their experience than stories about the wrong thing. Mara stood in the back during the remarks and listened without performing anything. Ruth found her and stood beside her, and they watched the gathering together without talking much, which was the mode they'd settled into over 4 months of proximity, comfortable with silence, informative without narration. Ruth said at one point, "She asked me about you." The woman from the organization. What did she ask? Whether you'd be willing to talk to mechanics in her network, people in similar situations. She thought your story might be useful to them. Ruth paused. I told her I'd pass it along. Mara considered it. She thought about what it would mean, not just the speaking, but the decision it represented. To attach her name to the story, not as the ending but as the model. To make visible, deliberately, the thing that she had spent 2 years concealing. Tell her yes, Mara said. Ruth looked at her. Just like that? Just like that. She watched the gang for a moment. I've been quiet long enough to know what it costs. I think it's time to find out what speaking costs and decide which is more worth carrying. Ruth nodded, slowly, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has watched a person arrive at a conclusion they'd been moving toward for a long time. Travis found Mara at the edge of the gathering as things were winding down. He had a look on his face that she'd come to recognize over 3 weeks, the look of a man who was thinking something he hadn't entirely decided to say yet. Say it, she said. He looked at her. The contracted techs are done at the end of this week. Standard arrangement. Yes, I've been talking to one of them. Her name is Simone. She's got 12 years on sport tours and 2 years on custom builds, and she's been doing contract work because the shop she was at before didn't. He stopped. She was in a situation with a former employer. That sounds familiar. Mara looked at him. She's good, Travis said. I mean, really good. And she did something on the pre-ride inspections last week that I wouldn't have caught. And when I asked her about it, she explained it in a way that made me feel like an idiot, and also like I just learned something I was going to use for the rest of my career. What's your point? My point is that the apprenticeship clause you added to the partnership agreement, he said. The one about non-traditional backgrounds and practical competency. He paused. I think Simone is exactly who that clause was written for. Mara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the language she'd insisted on, about the specific care she'd put into making eligibility broad enough to catch the people that narrow criteria missed, about why she'd cared about that enough to make it a condition. Set up a meeting for Monday, she said. The three of us. Travis nodded. He started to turn away, then stopped. For what it's worth, he said, I've been thinking about what you said when you accepted my apology. That it would be a waste if I stayed the kind of mechanic who can't hear a correct answer from the wrong person. He paused. I've been thinking about that a lot. Good, she said. I mean, what does that actually look like going forward? How do I make sure I'm not doing the same thing in a different version? She thought about it honestly. You pay attention to the moment when you want to dismiss something before you've actually evaluated it. That moment when the dismissal comes before the consideration, that's the version of yourself you're watching for. She paused. It doesn't disappear. It gets faster to catch. Travis nodded. He stood there for another second with the look of a man filing something away carefully. Then Monday, 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock, she confirmed. He walked back toward the gathering, and Mara watched him go. And she thought about what it meant that this conversation had happened, that Travis Boone, who had stood in a garage 2 weeks ago and held a door open for the first time, had arrived at the place where he was actively seeking the tool to correct his own error. Not because someone required it of him, because he had understood what was at stake and had decided to take it seriously. That was the thing that couldn't be forced or manufactured. That was the thing that had to be earned, and earning it meant something. Silas found her last, as the gathering thinned and the evening came down over Marlowe with the specific quality of autumn evenings in Tennessee, warm still, but carrying the first intimation of the cold that was coming. The way a door left open carries the outside temperature before you can see it. He said, "Good day." "Yes," she said. It was a complete answer. He stood beside her for a moment and looked at the street, at the last of the motorcycles carrying riders home, at the sign above the service entrance that was visible from where they stood. Verified Motorworks. The letters in the lowering light. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Not as a partner. Just as someone who was in that garage on day one." She waited. "I've been doing this, running the chapter, knowing people in this community, making judgments about who was worth paying attention to for 23 years. I'm good at it. Not perfect, but genuinely good." He paused. "I walked past you for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of test runs and failed diagnostics and $18,000 estimates. And you were in the room every single day, and I never once stopped to ask your name. You didn't have a reason to," she said. "That's exactly the problem," he said. "I should have had a reason to regardless. Every person in a room is a reason." He looked at her. "Jonah never made that mistake. In 18 years of knowing him, I never saw him walk past a person without at least acknowledging that they were there. Didn't matter what they were doing or why." He paused. "I've been trying to figure out why I'm worse at that than he was. And I think the answer is that he never decided in advance what kind of person was worth his attention. I have. I've been doing it so long I stopped noticing." Mara looked at him carefully. And now I've seen what I missed," he said. "That's not a small thing, even if it's a late one." She held his gaze. She thought about what it meant that a man with 23 years of the specific authority that Silas Maddox carried was standing in an empty parking lot in the evening, telling her this, not because he needed to, not because it served a strategic purpose, but because it was true. And he had decided that true things should be said. "The apprenticeship program," she said, "when we build it, I want you involved in the selection process." He looked slightly surprised. "Why?" "Because you just demonstrated exactly the quality I need in someone who's evaluating whether a person is worth investing in," she said. The ability to recognize your own error in reading people and decide to correct it. She paused. That's rare. And it's exactly the quality the people coming into that program are going to need someone to have. He was quiet for a moment. Then, all right, they stood there for another minute in the comfortable silence of two people who have arrived by different roads at the same place and have enough sense to appreciate it without needing to describe it. Then Mara said, I'm going back in. I want to go over the Simone documentation before Monday. Silas said, Of course you do. She started toward the shop entrance, and then she stopped because there was one more thing. There had been one more thing all day, carried at the back of everything, waiting for the right moment and the right words. She turned back. Jonah's Harley, she said. Silas looked at her. I want to do a full restoration document for her. The proper kind, a technical record of every original component, every repair made since manufacture, every mile that can be verified. She paused. Not to change anything, not to restore it to factory spec, to document what it actually is, a machine that was built by two people who mattered to each other and that has been kept by one of them for 18 years with more care than most people give anything. She held his gaze. That story deserves to be written down where it can be read. Silas was still for a moment. Then he said yes, simply, completely. The answer of a man who recognized the exact weight of what was being offered and accepted it without diminishing it by saying more. Mara nodded and went back into the shop. The lights inside were the same lights they'd always been. The smell was oil and metal and the specific working scent of a space that has been used honestly for serious purposes. The workbench was cleaned by Marco before he left, who had developed a habit of leaving things ready for the next morning without being asked, which was the sign of someone who had started to think of the space as his own. She sat at the bench and opened her notepad. She wrote, Verified Motorworks Restoration Record, Harley Davidson Electra Glide, 1998, and then she wrote the VIN number from memory, because she had memorized it on the first night, kneeling in the dark with a stethoscope and the last good decision of a long, cautious year, and some things, once learned correctly, stay with you exactly as long as they need to. She had come to Marlowe to be invisible. She had stayed to be honest. And she had built, out of 14 days of other people's failure to listen, something that would outlast every version of herself that had believed silence was the same as safety. It began with a woman who finally chose to be heard. It continued with every person in every room who finally chose to listen. And in Marlowe, Tennessee, in a shop, with a plain and honest name above the door, that choice had been made not once, not dramatically, but in the daily practice of getting things right, verifying what mattered, and treating every person in the room as someone worth knowing before you knew what they were worth. That was the work. That was all of it. And it was enough. And it was everything.